The noon sun cast harsh shadows across Silver Creek's main street, baking the packed dirt into a dusty hardpan. Jackson Foster squinted against the glare, his daughter Sophie's small hand gripped tightly in his own. The quiet afternoon had been shattered moments earlier when Lester Dobbs, drunk and desperate after losing his month's wages at Faro, had stumbled out of the saloon waving a Remington revolver and demanding that someone return his money. "Everyone stay back," Jack ordered, gently pushing Sophie behind him toward the dubious shelter of a water trough. "Stay there, sweetheart. Don't move." Dobbs swung the revolver wildly, his bloodshot eyes fixing on the girl with dangerous unpredictability. "You think you're better'n me, Foster, always so damned righteous." Jack's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw. Not yet. 3 years as Silver Creek's reluctant sheriff had taught him that a drawn gun demanded to be fired, and he'd made a promise to himself, to his late wife, to Sophie, that he wouldn't take a life unless absolutely necessary. "Put it down, Lester. You're drunk, and you're scaring the children." Dobbs spat in the dirt. "Don't tell me what to do. I lost everything. Everything." The revolver wavered, then steadied, pointing directly at Sophie. Jack drew and fired in one fluid motion so fast that onlookers would later swear they never saw his hand move. The bullet struck Dobbs' shoulder with surgical precision, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt. The Remington clattered harmlessly beside him. As the echo of the gunshot faded, Sophie emerged from behind the trough, her eyes wide but unafraid. At 10 years old, she'd seen enough of frontier life to know the difference between necessary force and cruelty. Jack holstered his weapon and knelt beside her. "You all right, Sophie?" She nodded, solemn. "You didn't kill him." It wasn't a question, but Jack answered anyway. "No, he made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to die for it." He watched understanding bloom in her eyes so like her mother's, it sometimes stole his breath away. Rachel had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that had swept through Silver Creek during that terrible winter. She'd made him promise, as she lay dying, that he would teach Sophie compassion in this harsh land, that he would remember there was more to being a man than how fast you could draw. "Sheriff Foster." A young deputy hurried over, eyes darting nervously between Jack and the groaning Dobbs. "What should we do with him?" "Get Doc Mitchell to patch him up, then let him sleep it off in a cell," Jack replied, rising to his feet, "and find out who was cheating him at cards. This wasn't entirely his doing." The deputy nodded and hurried off, obviously relieved that Jack had handled the situation. Despite being sheriff for 3 years, Jack Foster remained something of an enigma to Silver Creek, a man who wore his gun with obvious reluctance, yet possessed skill that bordered on supernatural. A former Union Army scout who never spoke of the war, but whose nightmares sometimes woke Sophie in the small hours. A widower raising a daughter alone on the frontier, teaching her both how to shoot straight and which wildflowers were safe to eat. "Come on," Jack said, dusting off Sophie's dress. "Let's get you to Mrs. Hollister's for your lessons." They walked down the boardwalk past the general store, where Mr. Peterson swept endlessly against the persistent Wyoming dust, past the telegraph office, where young Billy Watson was posting a notice about the Union Pacific Railroad delegation arriving tomorrow. Silver Creek, in 1877, was a town caught between eras still rough enough that a man might be shot in broad daylight, yet civilized enough that girls like Sophie received proper schooling. "Sheriff," Peterson called out as they passed, "you hear about the train coming tomorrow, special car and everything? Railroad bigwigs coming to survey for the new spur line." Jack nodded. "I heard. They say Walter Blackwell himself is coming. You know, the Union Pacific director, war hero. They say he's bringing 6 men just to guard his private car." Something cold settled in Jack's stomach at the name, but he kept his expression neutral. "Is that so?" "Means progress for Silver Creek." Peterson continued, oblivious to Jack's discomfort. "Might even get a proper station instead of just a platform." "Progress?" Jack echoed, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Sophie looked up at him, too perceptive for her age. "What's wrong, Daddy?" "Nothing, darling." He squeezed her hand. "Just thinking about how busy tomorrow might be." The truth was more complicated. Walter Blackwell, a name from another life, from blood-soaked fields and whispered orders in the dark. Colonel Walter Blackwell, who had commanded the Special Reconnaissance Unit Jack had served in during the war. Blackwell, who had given orders that haunted Jack's dreams, even now, 12 years after Appomattox. After dropping Sophie at her lessons, Jack returned to the small sheriff's office where the deputy had already locked Dobbs in a cell. The man was unconscious, his shoulder bandaged where Jack's bullet had passed cleanly through. Jack settled at his desk, pulling out a stack of wanted posters and telegraph notices, but his mind kept returning to Blackwell. What would the railroad baron make of finding his former scout serving as sheriff in a dusty Wyoming town? Would he even remember Jack? Or had he been just another tool in the colonel's vast arsenal? More importantly, would Blackwell reveal what Jack had really done during the war? The town knew him as a scout, a tracker, skills he still used as sheriff. But few knew that Captain Jack Foster had also been one of the Union's most effective assassins, eliminating key Confederate officers with terrifying precision. It was work Jack had believed in at the time, convinced he was helping end the bloodshed sooner. Only later did he understand how thoroughly the war had stained his soul. Rachel had known. She'd loved him anyway, had helped him build a new life far from the battlefields. And when she'd died extracting that final promise from him, Jack had dedicated himself to being the man she'd believed he could be, one who used his skills to protect, not destroy. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Catherine Mitchell stood in the doorway, her medical bag in hand. "I've come to check on your prisoner, Sheriff," she said, her Boston accent still noticeable despite 6 months in Wyoming. "Doc Mitchell asked me to follow up." Jack gestured toward the cells. "He's all yours, Doctor. Still sleeping it off." Catherine Mitchell was a rarity in the West, a female physician with formal training. She'd arrived in Silver Creek half a year ago, enduring skepticism and outright hostility until a mining accident had required more medical help than old Doc Mitchell could provide alone. Her skill had earned her grudging acceptance from most of the town, though some still refused to be treated by a woman. Jack respected her determination. The frontier wasn't kind to women who defied convention, yet Dr. Mitchell faced each challenge with quiet dignity. She examined Dobbs efficiently, then returned to Jack's desk. "Clean shot. No fragments, minimal tissue damage. He'll have use of his arm in a few weeks." "Good," Jack said, "though I doubt he'll thank me for my restraint." A smile touched her lips. "Few do, in my experience." She hesitated, then added, "That was impressive shooting. Most men would have aimed for center mass." "Most men haven't seen what a bullet does to a man's chest," Jack replied, then immediately regretted the darkness of his response. But Catherine didn't flinch. "No," she said quietly. "They haven't." Something in her tone made Jack look closer. Her eyes held a familiar shadow, the same he sometimes glimpsed in his own reflection. "You served?" he asked, surprised. "Field hospital at Antietam. Then Petersburg." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "I wasn't officially commissioned, of course, just a nurse on paper. But I performed more surgeries than I care to remember." Jack nodded, a new understanding forming between them. War has a way of putting people where they're needed, regardless of what the rules say. "Indeed." She gathered her bag. Will you be at the reception tomorrow for the railroad delegation? As sheriff, I don't have much choice. Well then, she said, heading for the door. Perhaps I'll see you there. Town council insisted I attend. Apparently they want to show off that Silver Creek is progressive enough to have a female doctor. After she left, Jack returned to his paperwork, but his mind kept circling back to Blackwell's impending arrival. By evening, when he collected Sophie from Mrs. Hollister's and walked her home to their small house at the edge of town, he'd decided there was no use in worrying. Blackwell might not even remember him. And if he did well, Jack would deal with that when it happened. Their house was modest but comfortable, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small parlor with actual glass windows, a luxury Jack had insisted on for Sophie's sake. Behind the house stood a small stable for their horses and a vegetable garden that Sophie tended with remarkable dedication for a child her age. As they prepared supper together, a rabbit stew with vegetables from their garden, Sophie chattered about her lessons, her friends, and her plans to help Mrs. Hollister organize the classroom library. Jack listened, cherishing these simple moments. After Rachel's death, there had been months when Sophie barely spoke at all. Her gradual return to childish enthusiasm felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. "Daddy," she said as they washed the dishes together, "Tommy Watson says a real live railroad president is coming tomorrow. Will he have a fancy suit like in the catalog pictures?" Jack smiled. "I expect so. City folks tend to dress for show even out here. Can I see the train when it comes? Please." "We'll see. It's likely to be crowded at the station." Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. "Tommy also said his pa said this might change everything for Silver Creek. Is that true?" Jack considered how to answer. The railroad meant growth, commerce, prosperity, all things that most townspeople eagerly anticipated. But it also meant change, and not all change was for the better. He'd seen quiet settlements transformed into rowdy boomtowns, watched as traditional ways of life were swept aside in the name of progress. "It will change some things," he said carefully. "More people will come. The town will grow." "Is that good?" Jack dried a plate slowly. "It depends on who those people are and how they treat what's already here." Sophie nodded, accepting his answer with the solemnity she sometimes displayed. "Mrs. Hollister says change is like a storm. It can water your crops or wash them away. You have to be ready either way." "Mrs. Hollister is a wise woman," Jack said, hanging the dish towel. "Now, time for bed. Tomorrow will be a busy day." After tucking Sophie in and reading her a chapter from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, a book Jack found slightly too advanced for her, but which she insisted on, he sat on the porch with his pipe watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The peace of the evening stood in stark contrast to the unease churning inside him. Walter Blackwell. The name conjured memories of whispered orders, of slipping behind enemy lines, of the weight of a knife rather than a gun, of missions that didn't exist in any official record. Jack had left that life behind, or thought he had. But the frontier had a way of shrinking when civilization pushed westward. The past had a way of catching up. He was still sitting there when the distant whistle of a train broke the night's silence. Too early. The delegation wasn't scheduled until tomorrow afternoon, a special train arriving under cover of darkness. That was Blackwell always preferring the advantage of surprise. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late September day. Jack dressed with extra care, donning his official sheriff's outfit, a clean black coat over a white shirt with his badge polished to a shine. Sophie wore her Sunday best, a blue dress that Rachel had made for her before she died, now slightly too small but still her favorite. "You look handsome, Daddy," she said as they headed toward the station where a crowd had already gathered. "And you look beautiful," he replied, his throat tight with the memory of Rachel sewing that dress by lamplight. The train stood hissing on the tracks, its black iron body gleaming in the morning sun. Beyond the regular passenger cars was a private car ornately decorated with polished brass fixtures. A small contingent of men in railroad uniforms formed a perimeter around it, their posture suggesting they were more guards than conductors. Mayor Simmons stood on a hastily constructed platform, obviously nervous, as he prepared to welcome their important visitor. The town council flanked him with Doc Mitchell and Catherine, representing the medical establishment. Catherine caught Jack's eye and gave a small nod of recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Simmons called out, his voice cracking slightly. "It is my great honor to welcome to Silver Creek a true American pioneer, a hero of the Union, and the visionary director of the Union Pacific Railroad, Colonel Walter Blackwell." The private car's door opened, and a tall figure emerged to polite applause. Even at a distance, Jack recognized him immediately. Blackwell had aged well in the 12 years since the war, his hair now silver rather than brown, his face more lined, but his posture still military straight. He wore an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than Jack earned in 6 months. Behind Blackwell came a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, with similar features but none of the older man's gravitas. He surveyed the crowd with obvious disdain, as though the dust of Silver Creek might somehow stain his equally expensive suit. Marcus Blackwell, the son Jack had heard about, but never met. Following them was a third man, lean and watchful, whose eyes scanned the crowd with professional assessment. Something about his gaze made Jack's instincts prickle. This was no ordinary railroad employee. This was a man accustomed to violence. Jack would bet his badge the man was armed despite his civilian clothes. Mayor Simmons launched into a flowery speech about progress and partnership, while Blackwell nodded with practiced patience. Jack used the moment to study his former commander more carefully. The colonel had always been ambitious, even during the war, always looking beyond the current battle to the broader campaign, beyond the campaign to the peace that would follow. It had made him an effective leader, if not always a compassionate one. That ambition had served him well after Appomattox. While many officers struggled to find purpose in peacetime, Blackwell had pivoted seamlessly to business, securing government contracts to build the Transcontinental Railroad, then parlaying that success into a directorship at Union Pacific. Now, he was one of the most powerful men in the country, shaping the very future of the American West. And so, Colonel Blackwell, we welcome you to Silver Creek and look forward to a prosperous partnership between our humble town and your magnificent railroad. The crowd applauded as Blackwell stepped forward to speak. His voice, like his posture, had not changed, deep, authoritative, accustomed to command. "Thank you, Mayor Simmons, and thank you, good people of Silver Creek. The Union Pacific Railroad is proud to include your fine community in our expansion plans. The new spur line will connect Silver Creek directly to our main route, bringing unprecedented opportunities for commerce and growth." He continued with practiced charm, speaking of progress and prosperity, with the confident certainty of a man accustomed to reshaping landscapes to his vision. The crowd listened, enraptured by promises of a brighter future. Then Blackwell's scanning gaze found Jack, and for the briefest moment his rhythm faltered. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by something harder to define: surprise, certainly, but also a calculating assessment. He recovered smoothly, continuing his speech without missing another beat, but Jack knew his presence had been noted. The question now was what Blackwell would do with that information. After the speech, the delegation was escorted to the Silver Creek Hotel, the town's only 2-story building, for refreshments and meetings with local business leaders. Jack kept to the periphery, maintaining order while avoiding direct contact with Blackwell. Sophie had been collected by Mrs. Hollister for her lessons, despite her protests that this was more educational than arithmetic. The afternoon passed without incident, and Jack began to hope that Blackwell might simply ignore his presence. That hope died when Deputy Collins approached him outside the hotel. "Sheriff Colonel Blackwell asked to see you in private. He's in the hotel dining room." Jack nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Keep an eye on things out here." The hotel dining room had been cleared of other guests. Blackwell sat alone at a table by the window, a glass of whiskey before him. The watchful man from earlier stood near the door, confirming Jack's assessment of his role. "Captain Foster," Blackwell said, rising, "or should I say Sheriff Foster now, please join me." Jack approached, noting that Blackwell had deliberately chosen a seat that put his back to the wall with a clear view of all entrances, old habits from wartime, perhaps, or simply the caution of a powerful man with potential enemies. "Colonel," Jack acknowledged, taking the offered chair. "It's been a long time." Blackwell studied him with undisguised interest. "I admit finding you here was unexpected. The last report I had, you were heading to California after your discharge." Jack kept his expression neutral. "Plans change." "Indeed they do." Blackwell gestured to the silent man by the door. "This is Derek Sullivan, my personal secretary and security consultant. Derek, this is Captain Jackson Foster, one of the finest scouts and marksmen the Union Army ever produced." Sullivan nodded, but remained by the door, his posture relaxed, yet alert. "I'm curious," Blackwell continued, "how a man of your particular talents ends up as sheriff in a place like this." Jack met his gaze steadily. "I married, settled down. When Silver Creek needed a sheriff, I took the job. Simple as that." "Simple as that," Blackwell smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "And does Silver Creek know what kind of man protects them, the full extent of your service record?" There it was, the veiled threat Jack had been expecting. He kept his voice level. "They know I was a scout for the Union, that I can track and shoot. That's all that matters here." "Is it?" Blackwell sipped his whiskey. "Well, your secret is safe with me, Captain. We all did what was necessary during the war, some more than others." The implication hung between them that Blackwell knew exactly what Jack had done under his orders and could reveal it any time he chose. "What do you want, Colonel?" Jack asked directly. "Want nothing at all. I'm simply reconnecting with a valued former subordinate." Blackwell leaned forward slightly. "Though I am curious, does your current position ever make use of your specialized skills, or have you truly left that all behind?" "I enforce the law," Jack said firmly. "Nothing more." Blackwell studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good for you. Finding peace after war isn't easy. I'm glad you managed it." He glanced at Sullivan. "Derek, give the sheriff and me a moment, would you?" Sullivan hesitated, then nodded and stepped outside. Once they were alone, Blackwell's manner changed subtly, becoming less formal. "I mean it, Jack. I'm glad you found your way. Not all of our unit did." "I know. The statistics were grim. Many of the men who'd served in their special reconnaissance unit had struggled after the war, turning to drink violence or suicide when peace proved harder than combat. I followed a different path," Blackwell continued, "but we're not so different. We both build things now. You, a community. Me, the means to connect communities." Jack wasn't sure he agreed with the comparison, but he nodded politely. "My son Marcus, he doesn't understand what we lived through," Blackwell said, his expression darkening. "He sees only the power and wealth that came after, not the blood and sacrifice that made it possible. An unexpected confidence, and Jack wasn't sure how to respond. He settled for, "The younger generation has its own challenges." "Indeed," Blackwell finished his whiskey. "Well, Sheriff, I won't keep you from your duties. We'll be in town for several days surveying potential routes for the spur line. I look forward to seeing more of Silver Creek." Jack stood, recognizing the dismissal. "Colonel?" "Oh, and Jack," Blackwell's voice stopped him at the door. "I'd appreciate your discretion regarding our shared history. The war is best left buried, don't you think?" Jack nodded once and left the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders. The town had organized a reception at the Silver Spur Saloon that evening, a more relaxed affair than the formal welcome at the station. Jack had collected Sophie from Mrs. Hollister, unable to deny her pleading to attend at least part of the festivities. They arrived to find the saloon unusually crowded, with most of Silver Creek's respectable citizens in attendance. Blackwell held court near the bar, charming the town's business leaders with tales of how other communities had flourished with railroad access. Marcus Blackwell stood nearby, looking bored and occasionally whispering to Sullivan, who remained vigilant despite the festive atmosphere. Jack kept Sophie close, exchanging polite greetings with townspeople while maintaining a watchful eye on the proceedings. Catherine Mitchell arrived shortly after they did, drawing curious glances in her formal but modest evening dress, a reminder that a female physician remained a novelty even to those who accepted her professional services. She made her way to Jack's side, nodding a greeting. "Sheriff, and this must be Sophie. I've heard so much about you from Mrs. Hollister." Sophie beamed at being addressed directly. "Are you really a doctor, with a real doctor bag and everything?" Catherine smiled. "I am indeed. Would you like to see my medical bag sometime?" "Yes, please. I've been reading about Florence Nightingale. She was a nurse in a war." "She was," Catherine agreed, "and a remarkable woman. Perhaps you'll follow in her footsteps someday." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the bar. Marcus Blackwell, clearly several drinks into the evening, had cornered one of the young women who worked at the hotel. His voice carried across the suddenly quieter room. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't be so cold. I'm offering you a private tour of our railroad car. Most girls would jump at the chance." The young woman, Jenny Palmer, barely 18 and new to Silver Creek, tried to step away. "Thank you, sir, but I'm working." Marcus caught her wrist. "I'm sure your employer would understand. After all, my father practically owns this town now." Walter Blackwell was engaged in conversation across the room, unaware of his son's behavior. Sullivan watched from nearby, but made no move to intervene. Jack felt Sophie's hand tighten in his. He glanced down to find her looking up at him with troubled eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "that man is being mean to Miss Jenny." She looked scared. Jack hesitated. Interfering with the railroad director's son was risky, especially given his complicated history with Blackwell. But Sophie was watching, learning from his every action what it meant to be a man of principle. "Wait here with Dr. Mitchell," he said quietly, disengaging his hand from Sophie's. Catherine nodded understanding immediately. "We'll be fine, Sheriff." Jack moved through the crowd with unhurried purpose, his presence creating a natural path as people stepped aside. He reached the bar just as Marcus pulled Jenny closer, his other hand moving to her waist. "Mr. Blackwell," Jack said, his voice pitched to carry just far enough. "I believe the lady has declined your invitation." Marcus turned, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a private conversation, Sheriff." "Not anymore." Jack positioned himself subtly between Marcus and Jenny. "Miss Palmer, are you all right?" Jenny nodded gratefully. "Yes, Sheriff. I was just explaining that I need to return to my duties. Then don't let us keep you, Jack said, stepping aside to give her a clear path away from Marcus. She hurried away, relief evident in her quick steps. Marcus's face darkened with anger. You have no idea who you're interfering with, he said, alcohol slurring his words slightly. My father would expect his son to behave like a gentleman, Jack finished firmly, especially in public. Sullivan appeared at Marcus's elbow. Perhaps another drink isn't the best idea, Mr. Blackwell. Marcus shook him off. Don't tell me what to do, Derek. I pay your salary. The confrontation had drawn attention. Walter Blackwell was now making his way through the crowd, his expression thunderous. What's going on here? He demanded, looking between his son and Jack. Before either could answer, a small voice spoke up from nearby. That man was scaring Miss Jenny and Daddy told him to stop. Sophie had left Catherine's side and approached, her young face serious as she looked up at Walter Blackwell. Blackwell's expression changed as he looked down at the child, then at Jack. Understanding dawned in his eyes. I see. And who might you be, young lady? Sophie Foster, sir. My daddy's the sheriff. Is he now? Blackwell glanced at Jack with new assessment. And a father as well. He turned to Marcus, his voice hardening. Apologize to the sheriff and his daughter for causing a disturbance, Marcus. Then return to the hotel. Marcus stared at his father in disbelief. You can't be serious. I was just... Now, Marcus. The command in Blackwell's voice was unmistakable, the same tone Jack had heard him use to order men into battle. Marcus flushed with humiliation, but complied, muttering an apology, before storming out, Sullivan following discreetly behind. Blackwell turned to the watching crowd. My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Please continue enjoying your evening. As conversations hesitantly resumed, Blackwell faced Jack directly. It seems I owe you an apology as well, Sheriff. My son sometimes forgets himself. Jack nodded, acutely aware of Sophie still standing beside him. No harm done. Your daughter is quite brave. Blackwell observed, his eyes softening as he looked at Sophie. She reminds me of my late wife. Elizabeth never hesitated to speak her mind even to generals and politicians. The personal revelation surprised Jack. Blackwell had never mentioned his wife during the war. I lost my wife 3 years ago, Jack said, the words emerging before he could consider them. Sophie's mother. Something like genuine sympathy crossed Blackwell's face. I'm sorry to hear that. Elizabeth passed just after the war. Typhoid. The finest doctors in Philadelphia couldn't save her. He glanced toward Catherine, who had joined them. Perhaps if we'd had physicians of your caliber, Doctor. Mitchell, Catherine supplied. Catherine Mitchell. And I doubt I would have made a difference. Typhoid is merciless, regardless of who treats it. Nevertheless, Blackwell said, I've come to believe that frontier medicine often achieves what city doctors cannot, simply through necessity and innovation. I'd be interested in hearing about your experiences sometime, Doctor. Catherine raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his interest. I'd be happy to discuss medical advances with you, Colonel. The conversation shifted to safer topics, with Blackwell asking Sophie about her schooling and expressing approval of her interest in medicine. Jack watched the interaction with mixed emotions. This was a side of Blackwell he'd never seen during the war, personable, even charming, particularly with Sophie. As the evening continued, Jack kept a watchful eye out for Marcus's return, but the younger Blackwell did not reappear. Eventually, Sophie began to yawn, and Jack made their excuses. Of course, Blackwell said, children need their rest. It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Sophie. Perhaps I'll see you again before we leave town. As Jack and Sophie walked home through the quiet streets, she looked up at him thoughtfully. That man, the important railroad man, he seemed nice. Jack considered how to respond. People are complicated, Sophie. Sometimes they can be both good and bad in different ways. Like in your stories about the war, how sometimes good men did bad things, and bad men did good things. Something like that. Jack agreed, impressed by her insight. The younger man, his son, he wasn't nice, Sophie continued. His eyes were angry even when he was smiling. Jack squeezed her hand. You're very observant. That's an important skill. Will he make trouble for you, Daddy, because you stopped him from being mean to Miss Jenny? The question hit uncomfortably close to Jack's own concerns. Marcus Blackwell had the look of a man who nursed grudges, and his humiliation had been public. Don't you worry about that, Jack assured her. I can handle young Mr. Blackwell if necessary. But as they reached their small house, Jack couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. His past, present, had collided today in ways he hadn't anticipated. Walter Blackwell knew his secrets and could expose them any time. Marcus Blackwell had been publicly chastised because of Jack's intervention, and the railroad itself would bring changes to Silver Creek that were impossible to predict. As he tucked Sophie into bed, Jack found himself wondering if the peace he'd built here was about to be shattered, and what he would do if it was. That night, Jack dreamed of the war. Not the battles themselves, but the quiet moments between slipping through enemy lines in darkness, waiting in perfect stillness for a target, the weight of Blackwell's orders pressing on him like a physical burden. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the phantom smell of gunpowder in his nostrils. Unable to return to sleep, he sat on the porch watching the stars fade and the eastern sky lighten. The railroad delegation would begin their survey today, choosing the exact route the spur line would take to connect Silver Creek to the main track. Decisions would be made that would reshape the town's future, and perhaps Jack's as well. As the first rays of sunlight touched Silver Creek, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The past he'd tried so hard to bury had followed him here in the form of Walter Blackwell and his ambitious railroad. The question now was whether Jack could protect what mattered most: Sophie, his new life, the town that had given him a second chance from whatever storm was brewing on the horizon. 3 days after the railroad delegation's arrival, Silver Creek hummed with excitement. Surveyors in crisp uniforms crisscrossed the surrounding countryside, taking measurements and driving stakes into the Wyoming soil. Locals followed their progress with keen interest, speculation running wild about which properties might increase in value once the route was finalized. Jack Foster watched it all with practiced neutrality. As sheriff, he maintained order as the town swelled with newcomers, railroad workers, opportunistic merchants, and land speculators drawn by rumors of the coming spur line. But beneath his professional demeanor, unease gnawed at him. He'd managed to avoid further direct interaction with Walter Blackwell, though he occasionally caught the colonel watching him from a distance with that calculating gaze. Marcus Blackwell had also kept his distance, but the venomous glares he shot Jack's way whenever their paths crossed suggested his humiliation at the saloon remained fresh. "Sheriff," Deputy Collins hurried into the office, interrupting Jack's thoughts. "There's been an announcement. Colonel Blackwell's calling a town meeting at noon. Says he's ready to reveal the proposed route." Jack nodded, unsurprised. The surveyors had been thorough and efficient. Blackwell didn't waste time once a decision was made. Also, Collins added, his voice dropping, "There's talk they want to relocate part of the old cemetery to make way for the tracks. Some folks are mighty upset about that." This was news. The old cemetery lay on the western edge of town, containing Silver Creek's earliest settlers and a number of graves from the region's various conflicts. Which part? The far section mostly, where some of the miners and... Collins hesitated. And, Jack prompted, and the unmarked graves. You know the Chinese workers, some Indians. Jack frowned. That section held the remains of those Silver Creek had deemed unworthy of proper markers laborers brought in for the mine's indigenous people who'd died during the town's early conflicts. Their graves were designated only by simple stones or wooden markers that had weathered away over the decades. "I'll be at the meeting," Jack said, reaching for his hat. "Keep an eye on things here." The town hall was packed by noon, with latecomers spilling onto the street outside. Jack positioned himself near the back wall where he could observe the entire room. Catherine Mitchell stood nearby, acknowledging him with a brief nod. "Quite the turnout," she murmured, as Mayor Simmons called for order. "People get interested when their future's being decided," Jack replied. Blackwell took the stage with practiced authority flanked by Sullivan and a railroad engineer carrying rolled maps. Marcus lounged in a chair at the side, looking bored with the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwell began, his resonant voice commanding immediate attention. "After careful survey, we've determined the optimal route for connecting Silver Creek to the Union Pacific Main Line." The engineer unrolled a large map, pinning it to an easel. Red lines marked the proposed track, cutting through existing properties and natural features with the implacable precision of progress. "As you can see," Blackwell continued, "the route requires minimal modification to Silver Creek's existing structure. Most of the town will remain untouched. However, there are two areas requiring significant adjustment." He indicated the western edge of the map. "First, we'll need to relocate a portion of the old cemetery. The Union Pacific will bear all costs for respectful reinterment of the remains." A murmur swept through the crowd. Mrs. Abernathy, Silver Creek's self-appointed historical guardian, rose to her feet. "Colonel Blackwell, that cemetery contains our founders. My own grandfather is buried there." Blackwell nodded solemnly. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Abernathy. I assure you all marked graves will be relocated with appropriate ceremony. We're primarily focused on the western section, which I understand contains mostly unmarked burials." "Those are still people's final resting places," Catherine said clearly, drawing surprised looks from those nearby. "Just because they weren't important enough for markers doesn't mean they should be disturbed." Blackwell regarded her with something like respect. "A fair point, Doctor, but progress often requires difficult compromises. The alternative route would require demolishing several active businesses in town, which would cause far greater hardship to the living." Before Catherine could respond, Blackwell continued, "The second adjustment concerns Miller's Creek and the surrounding land." Jack's attention sharpened. Miller's Creek was a small stream running through a narrow valley just outside town, unremarkable except for the scattered claims of elderly prospectors who had been panning there for years without notable success. "Our surveys indicate the creek needs to be diverted slightly to accommodate the rail bed," Blackwell explained. "The Union Pacific will purchase all affected claims at fair market value." An old man at the front, Ezekiel Wilson, who had been working the same unproductive claim for over a decade, stood up shakily. "And if we don't want to sell?" Blackwell's smile remained fixed. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Mr. Wilson. The railroad has been granted right-of-way authority by the territorial government. We prefer to purchase land outright, but we can exercise eminent domain if necessary." "Meaning you'll take it whether we like it or not," Wilson translated bitterly. "For the greater good of Silver Creek," Blackwell replied smoothly. "Think of the opportunities the railroad will bring: new markets for local goods, increased property values, more visitors. A small sacrifice for tremendous gain." The meeting continued with questions about construction timeline, employment opportunities, and compensation rates. Throughout, Blackwell maintained his commanding presence, addressing concerns with practiced reassurances while subtly reminding everyone of the railroad's power and the inevitability of its plans. Jack observed the proceedings with growing disquiet. On the surface, everything seemed above board. The route was logical, the compensation promises generous. But something about Miller's Creek nagged at him. Why focus on that unremarkable stretch of land when there were easier alternatives nearby? As the meeting adjourned, Jack caught Sullivan watching him intently. Their eyes met briefly before Sullivan turned away to confer with Marcus, who was already heading for the door, clearly bored by the proceedings. "Sheriff Foster," Walter Blackwell approached, extending his hand. "I hope you found our presentation satisfactory." Jack shook the offered hand briefly. "It seems you've thought of everything." "We try to be thorough." Blackwell lowered his voice. "I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment. There's a security matter that might benefit from your expertise." Curious despite his misgivings, Jack followed Blackwell to a small anteroom off the main hall. Sullivan joined them, closing the door. "I'll be direct," Blackwell said once they were alone. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around our survey teams. Men watching from a distance, potentially armed." Jack raised an eyebrow. "This is still frontier country, Colonel. Armed men aren't exactly unusual." "These men seem particularly interested in our work at Miller's Creek," Sullivan interjected. "They've been observed taking notes and measuring distances after our surveyors leave." "Claim jumpers, perhaps," Jack suggested, "or competing railroad interests. The Northern Pacific has been pushing into this territory." Blackwell shook his head. "I don't think so. This feels different." He fixed Jack with a penetrating look. "I'd like to hire you to investigate unofficially. Your tracking skills would be invaluable." Jack hesitated. "I'm the sheriff of Silver Creek. My duties would surely include investigating potential threats to the town's future." Blackwell finished smoothly. "The Union Pacific would compensate you generously, of course. Consider it consulting work. A test, perhaps. Or something more complicated." Jack couldn't tell, but his instincts warned him to proceed carefully. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But as sheriff, not as your employee." Blackwell smiled thinly. "As you wish. Sullivan will provide the details of where our men have spotted these observers." After the meeting, Jack headed directly to Miller's Creek. If something suspicious was happening there, he wanted first-hand observations before forming any conclusions. The creek wound through a shallow valley about 2 miles from town. Unremarkable in almost every way, a meandering stream perhaps 15 feet across, at its widest, bordered by scrubby vegetation and the occasional stunted tree. Half a dozen crude cabins dotted its length, homes to the aging prospectors who'd staked claims years ago. Jack found Ezekiel Wilson sitting outside his cabin, whittling a piece of wood with gnarled hands. At 72, Wilson was Silver Creek's oldest resident, a living connection to the early days of Western expansion. "Sheriff," Wilson acknowledged without looking up. "Figured someone official might come around after that meeting." Jack dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby post. "Just checking in, Ezekiel. That was quite a stand you took." Wilson snorted. "Wasn't much of a stand. Railroad's gonna take my claim whether I like it or not." He set down his whittling and fixed Jack with rheumy but sharp eyes. "Question is, why do they want it? 15 years. I've worked this creek, never found more than enough dust to buy supplies. Certainly not enough to interest a railroad man." The same question that had bothered Jack. "Mind if I look around?" "Help yourself. Might as well see what I'm losing." Jack walked the length of Wilson's claim, studying the terrain with a tracker's eye. The creek itself was shallow, Its bed mostly small stones and silt. Nothing remarkable about the water or the surrounding soil that he could discern. The proposed railroad route would cut directly across the creek at its widest point, requiring a small bridge and the diversion Blackwell had mentioned. As he worked his way upstream, Jack noticed something odd, fresh boot prints that didn't match Wilson's worn footwear. Someone had been here recently, moving with purpose rather than the casual meandering of a prospector. The prints led away from the creek toward a ridge overlooking the valley. Jack followed his hand, resting casually near his holster. The tracks led to a sheltered spot with a clear view of the entire creek bed, a perfect observation post. There, pressed into the dirt, he found clear evidence someone had lain prone for some time, watching. Nearby, a freshly extinguished campfire and the remains of a coffee tin suggested the observer had been comfortable enough to prepare a hot drink. A twig snapped behind him. Jack spun, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. "Whoa there, Sheriff!" Derek Sullivan raised his hands, stepping out from behind a boulder. "Just me." Jack didn't lower his weapon immediately. "Following me, Mr. Sullivan." "Observing," Sullivan corrected, his posture relaxed despite the gun aimed in his direction. "Colonel Blackwell was interested in your assessment. So interested, he sent his watchdog to spy on me." Jack finally holstered his revolver but remained alert. Something about Sullivan had bothered him from the beginning, a familiar quality he couldn't quite place. Sullivan's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "The Colonel appreciates thoroughness. You found the observation post, I see. Someone's been watching the creek. Recently." Jack studied Sullivan more carefully. "But you already knew that." "We've had men keeping an eye on all our survey sites," Sullivan admitted. "Standard procedure." "Is it also standard procedure to lie to the local sheriff about mysterious observers when it's actually your own men?" Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "The Colonel exaggerated the situation to secure your involvement. He values your perspective." "Why," Jack pressed, "what's so special about this worthless creek that Blackwell needs my assessment?" "Perhaps you should ask him yourself." Sullivan nodded toward the ridge. "He's waiting at Wilson's cabin." Irritation flared in Jack, but he controlled it. This felt like the old days, Blackwell orchestrating situations, revealing only what he deemed necessary, manipulating pieces on a chessboard only he could fully see. They walked back in silence. Sure enough, Walter Blackwell sat on Wilson's porch, deep in conversation with the old prospector. Both men looked up as Jack and Sullivan approached. "Ah, Sheriff," Blackwell greeted him. "Mr. Wilson has been sharing fascinating stories about Silver Creek's early days." Wilson looked uncomfortable, as though he'd said more than he intended. He nodded to Jack and retreated into his cabin without another word. "Was there a point to this charade, Colonel?" Jack asked bluntly once Wilson was out of earshot. Blackwell's genial expression didn't waver. "I needed your unbiased assessment of the area. If I'd told you everything, you might have seen what you expected to see rather than what's actually there." "And what exactly is there? Tell me what you observed." Jack recognized the technique from wartime Blackwell, testing subordinates' perceptions before revealing his own information. He decided to play along for now. "The creek is unremarkable. Shallow water, ordinary stones, minimal gold potential based on Wilson's 15 years of minimal findings. Someone's been watching it recently, your men apparently. And the railroad wants this specific route badly enough to invoke eminent domain rather than choose an easier alternative." Blackwell nodded approvingly. "Excellent summary. What conclusions do you draw?" "That there's something here you want that isn't immediately visible. Something worth displacing old graves and forcing out stubborn prospectors." "Very good. Blackwell stood brushing dust from his expensive trousers. "Walk with me, Sheriff." They moved upstream away from Wilson's cabin. Sullivan followed at a discreet distance. "What do you know about the Black Hills Gold Rush?" Blackwell asked once they were out of earshot. "Started about 2 years ago," Jack replied. "Caused quite a stir, especially with the Sioux, since it violated their treaties." "Indeed. Thousands of men rushing to stake claims, most finding nothing but hardship. But the gold is there in tremendous quantities. The problem is reaching it." Blackwell stopped gesturing at the unremarkable landscape around them. "Most people think gold is found where you can see it in streams ready to be panned. The truth is more complicated." Jack began to understand. "You're saying there's gold here. Not in the creek, but underground," Blackwell confirmed. "Our geologists have been surveying the entire region. Their analysis suggests a significant vein running directly beneath this valley, not visible to traditional prospectors panning the creek, but potentially one of the richest deposits in the territory." The pieces clicked into place, and the railroad needs to control this land before anyone realizes what's here. "Precisely. If word got out, we'd have another rush on our hands. Land prices would skyrocket. The territorial government might reconsider its grants. Indigenous tribes might assert claims." Blackwell's expression hardened. "We've invested too much to allow such complications." "So you'll divert the creek, build your railroad, and quietly acquire mineral rights along the way," Jack concluded. "Very neat. It's business, Sheriff. The railroad needs to be profitable to continue expansion. This gold could finance tracks all the way to Seattle." Jack thought of Wilson and the other elderly prospectors who'd spent decades working worthless claims, unaware of the fortune beneath their feet. "And the men who've lived here for years will be compensated fairly for their surface rights," Blackwell said dismissively. "More than fair given what they've actually managed to extract from the creek. But not for what lies beneath. They never found it. Never would have found it. Why should they profit from blind luck?" The ruthless calculation was pure Blackwell. Jack had seen it during the war, the colonel's ability to balance human cost against strategic advantage with cold precision. He'd been effective precisely because sentiment never clouded his judgment. "Why tell me this?" Jack asked finally. "You must realize I might object to your methods." Blackwell smiled thinly. "Because I respect your intelligence, Jack, and because I'd rather have you working with us than against us." "Working with you, how exactly?" "As a consultant on security matters, the railroad will need protection during construction. Once mining begins, we'll need someone to oversee operations who understands both security and the local community." Blackwell's gaze was steady. "Someone with your unique background would be ideal." A generous offer on the surface, but Jack recognized the underlying message: cooperate and prosper or resist and face consequences. "I'll consider it," he said neutrally. "Do that." Blackwell clapped him on the shoulder. "Think of Sophie's future. A man in your position with the railroad could provide opportunities most fathers only dream of. The finest schools back east, perhaps even Europe." The mention of Sophie sent a chill through Jack, a reminder that Blackwell knew exactly where to apply pressure. Before Jack could respond, a shot rang out from the direction of Wilson's cabin. Both men froze, then broke into a run, Sullivan overtaking them with weapon already drawn. They rounded a bend to find Wilson's cabin in chaos. The old prospector lay on the ground, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Marcus Blackwell stood over him, a smoking pistol in his hand. 3 rough-looking men Jack didn't recognize flanked him, also armed. "What the hell is this?" Walter Blackwell demanded, his face darkening with rage. Marcus turned surprise flickering across his features before settling into defiant contempt. "Handling business, Father. This old fool refused to sign the transfer papers." So you shot him. Jack pushed past Blackwell, kneeling beside Wilson to assess the wound. The bullet had passed through the old man's shoulder, painful but not immediately life-threatening if the bleeding could be controlled. He pulled a rifle, Marcus said defensively. It was self-defense. Wilson's ancient rifle lay several feet away, clearly unfired. Jack doubted the old man had even aimed it. More likely, he'd simply reached for it when confronted by armed intruders. "He needs a doctor," Jack said, pressing his bandana against the wound. "Now." "Sullivan, get Dr. Mitchell," Blackwell ordered, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And you three," he addressed the unknown men. "Whoever you are, clear out, now." The men looked to Marcus, who nodded tersely. They backed away, mounting horses tied nearby and riding off toward town. Once they were gone, Blackwell rounded on his son. "What were you thinking? We have a process for this, legal documents, proper procedures." "Your process was taking too long," Marcus snapped. "These claims should have been secured weeks ago. You're too soft, too concerned with appearances, and you're too impulsive." Blackwell's composure cracked, real anger bleeding through. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Shot an old man in front of the sheriff," Marcus sneered. "What's he going to do, arrest me? The railroad owns this town now. We can do whatever we want." Jack, still tending Wilson's wound, felt cold rage building inside him. This was the real face of progress, not Blackwell's polished speeches about opportunity, but the raw exercise of power over those who stood in its way. "You're under arrest, Mr. Blackwell," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Marcus laughed. "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious." Jack rose, his hand resting on his holster. "Attempted murder. Assault with a deadly weapon. Take your pick." "This is absurd, Father, tell him." "Shut up, Marcus." Walter Blackwell's voice cut like a whip. "You've done enough damage." He turned to Jack, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff, given Mr. Wilson's condition, perhaps we could delay formal charges until he receives medical attention. I give you my word, Marcus won't leave town." Jack hesitated. Wilson needed immediate care, and confronting Marcus now risked further violence. "He stays in town, no exceptions. I'll be by the hotel this evening to take his statement and formalize the charges." Blackwell nodded. "Understood." Hoofbeats announced Sullivan's return with Catherine Mitchell. She dismounted quickly, medical bag in hand, and hurried to Wilson's side. "What happened?" she demanded, professional focus overtaking any other reaction. "Gunshot wound, shoulder," Jack reported. "Clean through, but he's lost blood." Catherine worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound. "He needs to be moved somewhere clean where I can treat him properly. Not this cabin." "My private car has medical supplies," Blackwell offered. "And a clean environment." Catherine raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That will do. We need a stretcher or wagon." "I'll get my men," Sullivan said, already moving toward his horse. As preparations were made to transport Wilson, Jack pulled Blackwell aside. "This changes things." Blackwell's expression was grim. "I understand your position, Sheriff, but I ask you to consider the larger picture. Marcus acted rashly, unforgivably so, but charging the son of the Union Pacific's director with attempted murder would have consequences far beyond him for the railroad, for Silver Creek, for everyone involved." "The law applies equally," Jack said firmly, "even to the powerful." "In theory, perhaps." Blackwell's tone hardened. "But we both know the world doesn't work that way. There are better solutions than a public spectacle that benefits no one. Such as, allow me to handle Marcus. He'll be recalled to Philadelphia immediately, removed from the project entirely. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilson will receive compensation beyond anything he could imagine, enough to live in comfort for his remaining years. And justice. Justice takes many forms, Jack. Sometimes punishment, sometimes restitution. Blackwell lowered his voice, and sometimes silence about past actions that might otherwise destroy a man's new life. His standing in a community. His relationship with his daughter. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. If Jack pursued charges against Marcus, Blackwell would expose his wartime activities, the assassinations, the covert operations that had crossed lines most soldiers never approached. Before Jack could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of town. Riders approaching fast, raising dust against the afternoon sky. As they drew closer, Jack recognized Deputy Collins leading a group of townspeople. "Sheriff," Collins called as they reined in. "Thank God we found you. There's trouble in town." "What kind of trouble?" Jack demanded, instantly alert. "Fire at the school. Mrs. Hollister got most of the children out, but some are missing, including your daughter." The world seemed to stop around Jack. "Sophie," Collins nodded grimly. "No one's seen her since the fire started. Mrs. Hollister thinks she might still be inside." Without another word, Jack vaulted onto his horse. The last thing he heard as he galloped toward town was Blackwell shouting orders to Sullivan, but the words were lost in the thundering of hooves and the roaring of blood in his ears. All thoughts of Marcus Gold and railroads vanished. Only one thing mattered now. Sophie. Jack Foster rode hard toward Silver Creek, fear clawing at his throat. Smoke billowed above the town in an ominous gray column visible for miles across the Wyoming plains. The school, a modest wooden structure at the north end of town, had been Sophie's second home since Rachel's death. Mrs. Hollister, the stern but kind-hearted teacher, had become almost family. And now it was burning, with Sophie possibly still inside. As he crested the final ridge, Jack saw the full devastation. Flames engulfed the schoolhouse roof, black smoke pouring from shattered windows. A bucket line of townspeople fought desperately to contain the blaze, but their efforts seemed futile against the hungry fire. Jack leapt from his horse before it had fully stopped, rushing toward Mrs. Hollister, who sat on a nearby wagon tailgate, a blanket around her shoulders, and soot blackening her face. "Where's Sophie?" he demanded, scanning the huddle of frightened children nearby. Mrs. Hollister looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from smoke and tears. "I don't know, Jack. When the fire started, we evacuated quickly. I thought all the children were accounted for, but then realized Sophie and two others were missing, Tommy Watson and Lily Rodriguez." "Did anyone check the creek path?" Jack asked, grasping at possibilities. "Sometimes they go there during lunch." "We've looked everywhere," Mrs. Hollister interrupted, her voice breaking. "Some men checked the creek. Others searched the storefronts. The last time anyone saw them, they were inside." Jack turned toward the burning building, measuring distances, angles, possibilities. The front entrance was fully engulfed, but the back door might still be accessible. "Jack, you can't—" Mrs. Hollister grabbed his arm. "The roof's about to collapse." He shook her off gently. "My daughter's in there." Before anyone could stop him, Jack sprinted toward the rear of the building, shielding his face from the intense heat. The back door was partially blocked by fallen debris, but a narrow gap remained. Without hesitation, he kicked it wider and plunged into the inferno. Inside, the smoke was so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Jack dropped to his knees where the air was marginally clearer and crawled forward. "Sophie!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of flames. "Sophie, where are you?" The schoolroom was a maze of burning desks and falling timbers. Jack navigated by memory, making his way toward the small library corner where Sophie often spent her free time. The heat was unbearable, each breath scorching his lungs. A faint sound stopped him, not a voice, but a rhythmic tapping. Someone was alive, trying to signal for help. Jack followed the noise to a partially collapsed storage closet. The door was jammed, but through a small gap he could see movement inside. With desperate strength, he wrenched the door open. 3 small figures huddled inside Sophie, Tommy, and Lily, all alive, but coughing violently from the smoke. "Daddy!" Sophie cried, her voice barely a whisper. "I've got you," Jack said, gathering all 3 children as best he could. "Cover your mouths with your sleeves and stay low." A thunderous crack overhead warned that the roof was seconds from collapse. Jack hurried the children toward the rear exit, shielding them with his body, as burning debris rained down around them. They were almost there when a massive beam crashed down, blocking their path. "This way!" Jack shouted, spotting a window that was relatively clear of flames. He boosted Tommy through first, then Lily. As he lifted Sophie, a second beam gave way, striking him across the shoulders and sending him sprawling. "Daddy!" Sophie screamed from the window ledge. Jack struggled to his feet, pain lancing through his back. "Go! I'm right behind you." Sophie hesitated, then jumped to safety outside. Jack gathered his remaining strength and lunged for the window just as the roof collapsed behind him. He tumbled onto the dirt outside, rolling to extinguish the smoldering patches on his clothing. Willing hands pulled him away from the building as it finally succumbed to the flames, collapsing in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Through smoke-blurred vision, Jack saw Sophie being tended to by Catherine Mitchell, who had evidently arrived from Wilson's cabin. "She's all right," someone told him as he tried to rise. "Dr. Mitchell says she'll be fine. Just some smoke, no burns." Jack nodded, relief washing over him in a wave that left him momentarily weak. His back throbbed where the beam had struck him, but nothing seemed broken. He pushed away helping hands and staggered toward Sophie. Catherine looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal relief. "She's going to be fine, Sheriff." All 3 children were remarkably lucky. Sophie reached for him, and Jack gathered her into his arms, ignoring the pain that shot through his injured back. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice raspy from smoke. "Always," he promised, holding her tightly. "They locked us in," Tommy Watson said suddenly, his young face streaked with soot and tears. "We were getting books from the closet when someone shut the door and put something heavy against it." Jack froze, his relief giving way to cold fury. "Someone locked you in? Who?" Tommy shook his head. "Don't know. Didn't see. Just heard laughing." Catherine's eyes met Jack's over the children's heads. "This wasn't an accident," she said quietly. "No," Jack agreed grimly. "It wasn't." As the townspeople continued battling the last of the flames, Jack hugged Sophie once more, then stood. "Stay with Dr. Mitchell," he told her. "I need to find out what happened." Deputy Collins approached, his face grim. "Sheriff folks are saying they saw strangers hanging around the school before the fire. Rough-looking men, like those fellas who were with Marcus Blackwell at Wilson's cabin." The cold fury in Jack's chest crystallized into certainty. This was retaliation, swift, brutal, and aimed at what he valued most. Not a random act of violence, but a calculated message: cross Marcus Blackwell and suffer the consequences. "Where is Marcus now?" Jack demanded. "Don't know. Haven't seen him since he returned to town." Jack turned to Catherine. "Can you take Sophie to our house? Stay with her until I return." Catherine nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course. But Jack, be careful. Whoever did this—" "I know exactly who did this," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. and they're going to answer for it. He strode toward the Silver Creek Hotel, where the Blackwells maintained their temporary headquarters. Each step fueled his rage, but beneath it was a cold, tactical focus he hadn't felt since the war. Someone had deliberately endangered Sophie, had nearly killed her. There would be consequences. The hotel lobby fell silent as Jack entered, his clothes still smoldering in places, soot and blood streaking his face. The clerk behind the desk took one look at his expression and nervously pointed toward the dining room. "Colonel Blackwell is meeting with the town council," he stammered. Jack pushed through the doors without knocking. Walter Blackwell sat at the head of a long table surrounded by Silver Creek's prominent citizens and railroad officials. All conversation ceased as Jack entered. "Sheriff Foster," Blackwell began, rising from his chair. "We heard about the fire. I'm relieved to hear the children were—" "Where's Marcus?" Jack interrupted, his voice carrying dangerously in the sudden silence. Blackwell's expression hardened. "I don't know. After the incident at Wilson's cabin, he returned to town. I've been looking for him myself. Your son locked 3 children in a burning building." Jack said the words, precise and cutting. "Including my daughter." Shocked murmurs swept through the room. Mayor Simmons rose halfway from his chair. "Sheriff, that's a serious accusation." One of the children recognized the men who were with Marcus at Wilson's cabin. Jack continued, his eyes never leaving Blackwell. The same men he brought to intimidate Wilson were seen at the school shortly before the fire started. "If that's true," Blackwell said carefully, "I assure you it was not by my order or knowledge." "I don't care whose order it was," Jack replied. "I'm arresting Marcus Blackwell for attempted murder, and anyone who tries to stop me will face the same charge." The room erupted in chaotic discussion. Through it all, Blackwell remained focused on Jack, something like genuine regret in his eyes. "Sheriff, I understand your anger. If Marcus is responsible, he will face justice. But I ask you to proceed lawfully, not out of vengeance." "This is lawful," Jack said coldly. 3 witnesses saw his men. The fire was deliberately set. The children were intentionally trapped. I have more than enough for an arrest." Blackwell nodded slowly. "Then do your duty, Sheriff. But I warn you, Marcus is not stable. Approaching him directly could lead to further violence." "I'm counting on it," Jack said, turning to leave. "Wait," Blackwell's voice stopped him. "At least allow me to assist. If Marcus has truly done this terrible thing, I want him stopped as much as you do." Jack studied the older man skeptically. "How? Sullivan knows his habits, his likely hiding places, and Marcus might surrender peacefully to me but avoiding unnecessary bloodshed." The tactical part of Jack's mind acknowledged the logic, even as his rage demanded immediate action. "Fine, but we move now." Blackwell turned to the stunned town council. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this discussion later. A more urgent matter requires my attention." Outside the hotel, they found Sullivan waiting with horses. His expression betrayed no surprise at Jack's appearance or the tension between him and Blackwell. "Marcus?" Blackwell asked simply. Sullivan nodded toward the edge of town. "Holed up at Jennings's old cabin with those hired guns of his. Been drinking heavy since the Wilson incident." "Jennings's cabin?" Jack asked sharply. The abandoned trapper's hut sat near the old cemetery, the same cemetery the railroad planned to partially relocate. "It's isolated," Sullivan explained. "Good visibility in all directions, defensible, and conveniently close to both the cemetery and Miller's Creek." Jack noted the pieces clicking together in his mind. "How long has he been using it?" Sullivan hesitated, glancing at Blackwell. "Answer him," Blackwell ordered. Few weeks. It's where he meets with the Geological Survey team and other associates. Jack mounted his horse, checking his revolver. Let's go. The ride to Jennings's cabin took less than 20 minutes. They approached cautiously, using a ridge for cover as they assessed the situation. The cabin sat in a small clearing, smoke rising from its chimney. 2 horses were hitched outside, but there could be more around back. "I count 2 men on watch," Sullivan murmured, scanning with a small spyglass. "One on the porch, one by the western corner, both armed." "Marcus's men from Wilson's cabin," Jack confirmed, recognizing them even at this distance. "What's your plan, Sheriff?" Blackwell asked. Jack considered their options. A frontal approach would likely result in gunfire, possibly fatal for someone. But the cabin's position, while defensible, had weaknesses. Sullivan circle around to the back. If anyone tries to flee that way, stop them. Colonel, you approach from the front. Your presence might give them pause. I'll come in from the east side, using that stand of trees for cover. Blackwell nodded approvingly at the tactical assessment. "Like old times." "This isn't war," Jack reminded him coldly. "I want Marcus alive to face justice." They separated, each moving into position. Jack crept through the trees, using skills honed during years of scouting. From his vantage point, he could see the man on the porch stiffen as Blackwell rode openly toward the cabin. "Marcus," Blackwell called out, "we need to talk, son." The door opened slightly. Though Jack couldn't see who peered out, he heard Marcus's voice slurred with alcohol. "Go away, Father. I'm busy. This has gone far enough." Blackwell continued dismounting, but keeping his horse between himself and the cabin. "The sheriff knows about the fire, about the children." A harsh laugh erupted from inside. "Does he? Good, maybe. Now he understands who he's dealing with." Jack inched closer, using the distraction to approach the man at the western corner. The guard was so focused on Blackwell that he never noticed Jack until a revolver pressed against his back. "Drop it," Jack whispered. "Nice and easy." The man froze, then carefully lowered his rifle to the ground. "Now call out to your friend on the porch," Jack instructed. "Tell him to come check something." The guard hesitated, then called, "Hey, Liam, come look at this." The porch guard turned puzzled. "What is it? Just come here." As the second guard reluctantly approached, Jack remained hidden behind his captive. When the man rounded the corner, Jack's revolver shifted with lightning speed. "Both of you face down on the ground. Now!" They complied, recognizing the deadly intent in his voice. Jack quickly bound their hands with leather strips from his saddlebag, then signaled Sullivan, who had worked his way around to the rear of the cabin. "Marcus," Blackwell called again. "The game is over. Come out peacefully." For a long moment, silence hung over the clearing. Then the cabin door swung open fully, revealing Marcus Blackwell. He stood unsteadily, a bottle in one hand and a revolver in the other. "Peacefully," he spat. "Like you taught me, Father, with your war stories about necessary violence and acceptable casualties." He waved the gun erratically. "I was just following your example." Jack moved silently toward the porch, keeping to the shadows. From this angle, he could see inside the cabin. Maps and papers were scattered across a table, survey charts, property records, and what looked like assay reports showing gold concentrations. "This isn't about me," Blackwell said, his voice hardening. "You locked children in a burning building, Marcus. Children, there's no justification for that." Marcus laughed bitterly. "You're such a hypocrite. How many families did you destroy during the war? How many children were orphaned by your strategic decisions?" He gestured wildly with the revolver. "At least I'm honest about what I'm willing to do for progress." Put the gun down, son. We can work through this. Work through it! Marcus's voice rose hysterically. Like we worked through those claims at Miller's Creek, or the cemetery relocation, or Captain Foster's inconvenient moral objections. Jack froze at the mention of his name. What did Marcus know? That's enough, Marcus. Blackwell warned, his eyes flicking briefly toward Jack's position. No, it's not nearly enough. Marcus took a swig from his bottle. Why don't you tell your old war buddy what you really wanted from Miller's Creek? About the geological surveys that showed gold deposits running not just under the creek, but under the entire Western Cemetery. Jack's mind raced, connecting new dots. The cemetery relocation wasn't just convenient for the railroad track, it was essential for accessing the gold beneath. Or about how you used Captain Foster during the war, Marcus continued recklessly. How you sent his entire unit into that ambush at Cold Harbor, knowing they'd be sacrificed just so your main force could secure a strategic position. The world seemed to stop around Jack. Cold Harbor. The bloodiest day of his military service. Half his unit killed in what they'd been told was a reconnaissance mission, only to discover they'd marched directly into Confederate artillery. Jack had always believed it was faulty intelligence, a tragic mistake in the fog of war. But Marcus was suggesting something far darker, that Blackwell had deliberately sacrificed them. Marcus, stop this now, Blackwell commanded, his composure finally cracking. Why afraid your pet killer will turn on you when he learns the truth? Marcus swung the revolver toward his father. That the great Colonel Blackwell used him like a pawn, just like he uses everyone. Jack had heard enough. He stepped into view, his own weapon trained steadily on Marcus. Drop the gun. Marcus spun, nearly losing his balance. His eyes widened, then narrowed with drunken malice. Well, if it isn't the hero sheriff himself, come to arrest me for scaring your precious daughter. She could have died, Jack said quietly. All 3 children could have. Collateral damage, Marcus sneered, using his father's own wartime phrase. Isn't that right, Father? Acceptable losses for the greater goal. This has nothing to do with the war, Jack said, advancing slowly. Put down the gun and face the consequences of what you've done. For a moment, it seemed Marcus might comply. His shoulders sagged, and the hand holding the revolver lowered slightly. Then his eyes hardened with sudden resolve. No, he said simply, and raised the gun toward Jack. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Jack fired with the precision that had made him legendary during the war, his bullet striking Marcus's shoulder, the same disabling shot he'd used on Lester Dobbs days earlier. But 2 other bullets hit Marcus in the chest, thrown him backward against the cabin wall. He slid down, leaving a smear of blood on the rough wood, the revolver falling from his limp fingers. Jack spun toward the source of the other shots. Sullivan stood at the corner of the cabin, his smoking pistol still aimed at Marcus's crumpled form. He was going to shoot you, Sullivan said calmly, lowering his weapon. Jack turned to Blackwell, who stood frozen, staring at his son's body. The colonel's face was a mask of shock and something deeper, a haunted recognition, perhaps, that his own actions had led to this moment. Moving carefully, Jack knelt beside Marcus, checking for signs of life. There were none. The 2 chest wounds, both kill shots, had done their work with brutal efficiency. He's dead, Jack announced flatly. Blackwell approached slowly, his steps unsteady for the first time since Jack had known him. He knelt beside his son's body, reaching out to close the staring eyes with a gentleness Jack had never witnessed from him before. You didn't have to kill him, Blackwell said without looking up. His words directed at Sullivan. He was drawing on the sheriff, Sullivan replied, unmoved. And he knew too much. The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. Jack's hand moved back to his revolver as understanding dawned. This hadn't been a defensive reaction, it had been an execution. "What exactly did he know?" Jack asked quietly, his eyes shifting between Sullivan and Blackwell. Sullivan's expression remained impassive. "Nothing that concerns you, Sheriff." "I think it does." Jack nodded toward the papers inside the cabin. "Those reports show gold deposits under the cemetery, don't they? And what Marcus said about Cold Harbor, was that true?" Blackwell finally looked up, his face aged a decade in minutes. "Jack, there are explanations. I want the truth. Now." A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Blackwell sighed heavily. "Yes, there's gold under the cemetery. More than under Miller's Creek, perhaps the richest vein in the territory. The railroad route was designed specifically to secure those mineral rights. And Cold Harbor." Jack pressed, an old wound reopening within him. Blackwell met his gaze directly. "War requires sacrifices, Jack. Your unit provided the diversion we needed to secure a critical position. I made the call any commander would have made." "You sent us to die," Jack said, the reality of it settling like ice in his veins. "Your own men." "I sent you to complete a mission," Blackwell corrected, his composure returning. "The fact that you survived when others didn't is testament to your exceptional abilities. Abilities I recognized and continued to utilize." Jack's hand tightened on his revolver. Every instinct urged him to extract justice for his fallen comrades, for the years he'd spent believing their deaths were tragic necessity rather than calculated sacrifice. Sullivan tensed his own hand, hovering near his weapon. "Careful, Sheriff. This doesn't end well for anyone." Before Jack could respond, hoofbeats approached rapidly from the direction of town. Moments later, Deputy Collins appeared, riding hard. He reined in sharply at the sight of Marcus's body. "Sheriff, what happened here?" Jack kept his eyes on Sullivan as he replied. "Marcus Blackwell resisted arrest. Mr. Sullivan shot him." Collins looked between the three men, sensing the dangerous undercurrents. "I came to find you, Sheriff. There's trouble in town. Bad trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Jack asked, not relaxing his vigilance. "It's Dr. Mitchell and your daughter. Men broke into your house about an hour ago. Dr. Mitchell managed to get a message to us." Collins hesitated. "They've taken Sophie, Sheriff. Left a note saying you're to meet them at Miller's Creek at sundown, alone and unarmed." The world seemed to tilt beneath Jack's feet. "Who?" he demanded. "Who took her?" "Don't know for sure," Collins admitted. "But the doc said one of them mentioned finishing what Marcus started." Jack's focus snapped back to Sullivan, whose expression had changed subtly, a flicker of surprise quickly masked. "You didn't know about this," Jack realized. "This wasn't part of the plan." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "What plan?" "Marcus had more men in town than just these two," Jack said, indicating the bound guards. "Men who might take initiative after hearing about his arrest or death." "If someone has harmed your daughter," Blackwell began, rising to his feet, "I will bring the full weight of the Union Pacific." "Save it," Jack cut him off coldly. "Your promises mean nothing now." He turned to Collins. "What about Dr. Mitchell?" "They roughed her up pretty bad when she tried to stop them," Collins said grimly. "Doc's treating her at his office." Jack made a swift decision. "Take these two into custody," he ordered, pointing to the bound guards. "Then find Judge Parker. Tell him everything that's happened. The fire, Wilson's shooting, Marcus's death, Sophie's kidnapping. Everything." "What about him?" Collins asked, nodding toward Sullivan. Jack considered the man who had executed Marcus Blackwell with cold precision. "He's coming with me. We're going to find out exactly who's involved in this." Sullivan's hand moved slightly toward his gun. I don't take orders from you, Sheriff. Your employer's son is dead, Jack replied evenly, and your associates have kidnapped my daughter. Your choices right now are to help me find her or join these two in a cell. Choose quickly. For a tense moment, it seemed Sullivan might resist. Then, with deliberate care, he removed his gun belt and handed it to Jack. I had nothing to do with taking your daughter, and I know who might have. Who? Marcus wasn't just working with those two. Sullivan nodded toward the bound men. He recruited a former Confederate officer named Reynolds. Dangerous man with a personal grudge against Union veterans, especially those with specialized wartime experience. Jack's blood ran cold. How would he know about my war record? Sullivan's gaze flicked to Blackwell, who had the grace to look away. Marcus had access to his father's private correspondence, records. He found files on various operatives, including you, and shared them with a Confederate veteran with a vendetta. Jack concluded, the pieces falling into place. Where would this Reynolds take Sophie? Miller's Creek is the obvious choice, given the note, Sullivan said. But Reynolds is too smart for that. He'd expect you to bring reinforcements despite his warnings. The old mine, Blackwell suggested suddenly. The abandoned shaft near the cemetery. It's isolated, defensible, and connects underground to Miller's Creek. If they're working with the Geological Survey team, they'd know about it. Jack checked his watch. 2 hours until sundown, not much time to formulate a rescue plan. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't be facing this threat alone, and he certainly wouldn't be unarmed. Collins, change of plans, he said. Take these men to jail, then gather a posse. Have them ready at the edge of town in 1 hour. Don't tell anyone where we're going, not even the mayor. What about Colonel Blackwell? Collins asked. Jack regarded his former commander with cold assessment. Blackwell had manipulated him, sacrificed his comrades, and indirectly put Sophie in danger through his ambition and his failure to control his son. Yet his resources and knowledge might be crucial to rescuing Sophie. He's coming too, Jack decided. He owes me that much. Blackwell nodded gravely. Whatever you need, Jack. My men, my resources, they're at your disposal. I don't want your men or your resources, Jack replied. I want the truth about what we're walking into. Every detail about the mine, the gold deposits, and whatever else you've been hiding. You'll have it, Blackwell promised. All of it. As Collins rode back toward town with the prisoners, Jack turned to Sullivan. If you're lying about your involvement, or if anything happens to Sophie because of information you withheld, I'll kill you without hesitation. Are we clear? Sullivan met his gaze steadily. Perfectly clear, Sheriff. But understand this. I serve Colonel Blackwell, not Marcus. I eliminated a threat to the Colonel's interests. Nothing more. And where do my daughter and I fit in those interests? Jack asked coldly. That depends entirely on what happens next, Sullivan replied. Jack retrieved his horse, his mind already mapping out approaches to the mine's potential defensive positions, tactical advantages, and weaknesses. The soldier in him, the assassin, the scout had fully awakened, now pushing aside the sheriff's badge and all it represented. To save Sophie, he would become Captain Foster again, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The abandoned mine entrance gaped like an open wound in the hillside near Silver Creek's western cemetery, as the sun began its descent toward the Wyoming horizon. Jack Foster surveyed the terrain with a scout's precision, marking every approach, every potential vantage point, every shadow that might conceal a guard. The main shaft extends about 200 yards into the hillside, Walter Blackwell explained, keeping his voice low as they crouched behind a granite outcropping. The Geological Survey team mapped several side tunnels, including one that connects to a smaller shaft near Miller's Creek. "How many ways in and out?" Jack asked, mentally constructing the underground layout. "Three that we know of," Sullivan answered. "This main entrance, the secondary shaft near the creek, and a vertical air shaft about 50 yards in, though it's narrow, barely wide enough for a man to climb through." Jack nodded, his expression betraying nothing of the fear and rage churning inside him. Since learning of Sophie's abduction, he'd locked those emotions away, drawing on his military training to remain focused and clear-headed. Feelings wouldn't save his daughter. Strategy and precision would. "Defenses?" he asked, scanning the mine entrance for any sign of movement. "Reynolds was Confederate cavalry," Sullivan said. "He'll have men watching all approaches, probably tripwires or other alarms inside the mine itself." "How many men?" "Marcus hired 6 originally," Sullivan replied. "2 are in your jail. 1 fled after the fire. That leaves Reynolds and 2 others. Plus any local collaborators," Blackwell added grimly. "The Geological Survey team includes at least 2 men who've worked with Reynolds before." Jack absorbed this information, weighing options, calculating risks. "The posse is standing by at the edge of town. Deputy Collins has instructions to move in if we're not back by midnight." "Reynolds won't wait that long," Sullivan warned. "He's expecting you at Miller's Creek at sundown. When you don't show, he'll know something's wrong." "Then we move now," Jack decided. "Sullivan, you'll approach from the cemetery side, drawing their attention. Colonel, you'll remain here as our fallback position. I'll use the air shaft." "That shaft is barely navigable," Blackwell objected, "and you'd be going in alone against unknown numbers." "I've navigated worse," Jack replied flatly. "And I'm not giving Reynolds any chance to use Sophie as leverage. He needs to be neutralized before he knows we're coming." The cold precision in Jack's voice silenced further objections. Both men recognized Captain Foster had fully emerged, the deadly operative who had moved unseen behind enemy lines, who had eliminated strategic targets with ghost-like efficiency. "Sullivan, give me 30 minutes to get into position, then create your diversion. Nothing subtle, I want their full attention on the main entrance." Sullivan nodded, checking his borrowed revolver. "What about the colonel? If something goes wrong, he'll be exposed here." Jack's eyes met Blackwell's. Despite everything that had happened, the betrayals, the manipulations, the revelations about Cold Harbor, he found he could still read his former commander with disturbing accuracy. Blackwell was afraid, yes, but not for himself. "The colonel can handle himself," Jack said, "and he knows what's at stake." Blackwell held his gaze. "I do indeed." They separated without further discussion, each man understanding his role. Jack circled wide around the hillside, staying low and using the lengthening shadows for cover. His movements were methodical, his senses hyper-alert, noting bird calls that stopped abruptly, detecting the faint scent of tobacco that betrayed a hidden lookout, spotting the nearly invisible wire stretched across a natural approach. He dispatched the sentry silently, using skills he'd hoped never to employ again. The man never made a sound as Jack lowered his unconscious form to the ground, quickly binding and gagging him before continuing toward the air shaft. The vertical opening was just as Sullivan had described, a narrow gap in the rocky hillside, barely wide enough for a man to navigate. Jack removed his gun belt, tying it around his neck to keep his hands free. Then began the descent, finding fingerholds in the rough stone. The shaft descended about 40 feet before opening into a tunnel. Jack dropped the final few feet, landing in near total darkness. He remained motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust and his ears to detect any nearby presence. Faint light glowed from somewhere deeper in the mine lanterns, probably in the main chamber. Jack moved silently through the darkness, guided by the growing light and the sound of voices. The tunnel widened as he approached what appeared to be the main excavation area, a large cavern where the original miners had followed a promising vein until the ore played out. Pressing himself against the rough wall, Jack peered cautiously around a bend. The cavern was illuminated by 3 lanterns hung from support beams. Maps and equipment were scattered across makeshift tables, the Geological Survey Team's base of operations now commandeered for a darker purpose. In the center of the cavern, Sophie sat on a wooden crate, her small hands bound in front of her. Despite the fear evident in her posture, her expression remained defiant. Jack felt a surge of pride, even as rage threatened to overwhelm his tactical focus. 3 men occupied the cavern with her. 2 wore the canvas trousers and flannel shirts typical of local workers, though their gun belts and watchful postures marked them as hired muscle rather than miners. The 3rd man, pacing near Sophie with predatory attention, could only be Reynolds. He cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the hard physique of a man accustomed to physical challenges. His clothing was of higher quality than his companions', and the revolver on his hip appeared well-maintained. Most striking was the long scar that ran from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "Your father should have been at the creek by now," Reynolds was saying to Sophie, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of the Deep South. "Perhaps he doesn't value your safety as much as we thought." "My daddy's smarter than you," Sophie replied, her voice steady despite her evident fear. "He wouldn't walk into your trap." Reynolds laughed, the sound holding no humor. "Brave words, little girl, but Captain Foster has a history of walking into traps. Ask him about Cold Harbor sometime if you see him again." Jack froze at the mention of Cold Harbor. How much did Reynolds know about his wartime activities, and why this specific vendetta? "Jenkins," Reynolds called to one of his men, "check the entrance again. Our guest may be trying to be clever." As one of the men moved toward the main tunnel, a sudden commotion erupted from that direction, shouts followed by gunfire. Sullivan had begun his diversion right on schedule. "We've got company," Jenkins shouted, drawing his weapon. "Multiple hostiles at the entrance." "Damn it," Reynolds snarled. "Williams, get out the back way. Bring reinforcements from the creek." He grabbed Sophie roughly by the arm, pulling her to her feet. "The girl comes with me." Jack had heard enough. As Williams dashed toward a side tunnel and Jenkins headed for the entrance, he emerged from his hiding place, revolver trained on Reynolds. "Let her go," Jack commanded, his voice deadly quiet. Reynolds spun, surprise flashing across his scarred face before settling into the cold calculation. His hand moved toward his holster, but stopped when he realized Jack already had him covered. "Captain Foster," he drawled, recovering quickly. "Right on time, though, not from the direction I expected." "I said, let her go!" Jack advanced slowly, his aim unwavering. "Daddy!" Sophie cried, relief and fear mingling in her voice. Reynolds tightened his grip on her arm, positioning her partially between himself and Jack. "I don't think so, Captain. Not until we've had our little talk." "We have nothing to talk about," Jack replied, continuing his careful approach. "You took my daughter. That's all I need to know." "Oh, we have plenty to discuss." Reynolds's eyes burned with hatred. "Like how you and your specialized unit murdered my brother at Petersburg. A surgeon captain. An unarmed medical officer shot through the head by one of Colonel Blackwell's assassins." The accusation struck Jack like a physical blow. Petersburg. The field hospital operation. It had been a mission sanctioned at the highest levels. Intelligence had indicated a Confederate general was receiving treatment there. The mission parameters had been clear: eliminate the target, avoid civilian casualties. "Your brother was a surgeon," Jack asked, genuinely confused. Major Thomas Reynolds' Confederate Medical Corps. Reynolds confirmed, his voice tight with suppressed fury. Killed while tending wounded men, some of them your own soldiers, we'd recovered from the field. Shot by a coward who never showed his face. Jack's mind raced through memories of that night. The field hospital had been just behind Confederate lines, its large medical tents illuminated by lanterns. He'd infiltrated under cover of darkness, identified his target, a gray-haired officer with general's insignia, being treated for what appeared to be a chest wound, and taken the shot from concealment. Clean, professional, exactly as ordered. Except, your brother wasn't the target, Jack said slowly, pieces falling into place. Intelligence misidentified a medical officer as the general we were sent to eliminate. How convenient, Reynolds sneered. A mistake, just like Cold Harbor was a mistake. Just like this mining operation is a mistake. His grip on Sophie tightened, making her wince. Colonel Blackwell has built his fortune on mistakes that somehow always benefit him while others pay the price. Jack took another step forward, his focus absolute. Sophie's eyes met his, and he saw trust there, complete faith that her father would save her. That trust steadied his hand and cleared his mind. Whatever happened during the war, Sophie is innocent, Jack said calmly. This is between you and me. Let her go, and you can have what you want. Reynolds studied him, seeming to weigh the offer. And what do you think I want, Captain? Revenge, Jack replied simply. Me, dead or suffering. Blackwell exposed and ruined. Justice as you see it. A thin smile curved Reynolds's lips. Perceptive, but incomplete. He gestured toward the maps and equipment scattered around the cavern. This is about more than revenge. This is about taking what Blackwell and his railroad have been stealing across the West. The gold beneath this worthless town is just the beginning. The sound of gunfire intensified from the direction of the main entrance. Sullivan's diversion was drawing significant attention, but it wouldn't last forever. Last chance, Jack said, his voice hardening. Let her go. For a moment, it seemed Reynolds might comply. His grip on Sophie loosened slightly, and he shifted as if to push her forward. Then his expression changed, hardening into resolve. No, Captain. I think she stays with me. Insurance for my departure. His free hand moved toward his holster. Drop your weapon, or I'll show you exactly how much pain a man can endure before death. Jack had anticipated this moment, had calculated distances, angles, and reaction times from the moment he'd entered the cavern. As Reynolds's hand touched his revolver, Jack fired. The shot was perfect, threading the narrow gap between Sophie and Reynolds to strike the man's right shoulder, destroying his ability to draw his weapon. Reynolds staggered backward, his grip on Sophie broken by the impact. "Run to me, Sophie!" Jack commanded, already moving forward. Sophie darted toward her father, but Reynolds recovered with surprising speed. Despite his wounded shoulder, he lunged for the girl, catching the back of her dress with his good hand. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, desperation making him dangerous. Jack closed the distance in 3 long strides, holstering his revolver to free both hands. He struck Reynolds with calculated precision, not a wild blow born of rage, but the measured application of force to disable, without risking Sophie in the struggle. Reynolds released Sophie to defend himself, meeting Jack's attack with the trained responses of a cavalry officer. Despite his wounded shoulder, he was a formidable opponent, strong, experienced, and driven by hatred that transcended physical pain. "Sophie, get behind those crates and stay down," Jack ordered, as he blocked a vicious strike from Reynolds. The fight was brutal and efficient, 2 combat veterans using every technique at their disposal. Jack landed a solid blow to Reynolds's wounded shoulder, drawing a howl of pain, but the Confederate countered with a knee strike that nearly buckled Jack's legs. They grappled in the lantern light, each seeking the advantage that would end the confrontation. Jack felt the old battle instincts taking over the cold calculation of vulnerability, the dispassionate assessment of how much force was required to incapacitate an opponent. Reynolds managed to draw a knife from his boot, slashing wildly at Jack's midsection. Jack evaded the main thrust but felt the blade slice across his ribs, drawing blood. The pain barely registered through his focused determination. With a swift combination of strikes learned in countless close-quarter engagements, Jack disarmed Reynolds, sending the knife skittering across the cavern floor. A follow-up blow to the wounded shoulder drove the Confederate to his knees, his face contorted with pain. "It's over, Reynolds," Jack said, standing over his defeated opponent. "You've lost." Reynolds looked up, hatred still burning in his eyes. "It's never over, Captain. Not while men like Blackwell continue using men like you to do their dirty work. This gold, this land, it's all built on blood. Our blood." "Maybe so," Jack acknowledged, "but that doesn't justify threatening an innocent child." "There are no innocents in war," Reynolds spat. "Your colonel taught me that lesson when he sent you to kill my brother." Before Jack could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the main tunnel. Sullivan appeared, revolver in hand, his clothing dusty from the confrontation at the entrance. "Sheriff," he called, "the entrance is secure. Williams got away through the back, but we've got men pursuing him." He surveyed the scene, taking in the wounded Reynolds and Sophie hiding behind the crates. "I see you found what you were looking for." "Sophie," Jack called gently, "it's safe now. Come here." She emerged cautiously, then ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist despite her bound hands. Jack embraced her tightly with one arm, while keeping his other hand ready to draw if Reynolds made any sudden moves. "Are you hurt?" he asked quickly, checking her for injuries. Sophie shook her head, her brave facade finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "I told them you would." "Always," Jack promised, the single word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Sullivan approached Reynolds, his revolver trained on the wounded man. "What do you want to do with him?" "Sheriff?" Jack considered the question carefully. Reynolds was dangerous, determined, and now had a personal vendetta against both Jack and Blackwell. Simply arresting him might not be sufficient, not if he had allies who could help him escape or continue his revenge from behind bars. The cold, tactical part of Jack's mind calculated the simplest solution: eliminate the threat permanently. One shot easily justified given the circumstances. No one would question it, not after the kidnapping, not after Sophie had been endangered. It would be easy, clean, final. Sophie looked up at him, her young face streaked with tears, but filled with absolute trust. In her eyes, Jack saw not Captain Foster, the assassin, but Sheriff Foster, the protector, the man who upheld the law rather than circumventing it, who demonstrated justice rather than vengeance. "Bind his wounds," Jack instructed Sullivan. "Then we'll take him back to Silver Creek to face charges." Sullivan raised an eyebrow but nodded. "As you wish, Sheriff." As Sullivan secured Reynolds, Jack gently untied Sophie's hands, examining her wrists where the rough rope had left angry marks. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said softly. "It's not your fault, Daddy," Sophie replied with a maturity beyond her years. "That man was very angry about things that happened a long time ago, during your war." Jack nodded, wondering how to explain the complexities of the situation to a 10-year-old. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried no matter how hard we try to leave it behind. "Like Mama?" Sophie asked quietly. We don't want to forget her, even though remembering hurts sometimes. The simple insight struck Jack deeply. That's right. Some memories we keep close even when they're painful. Others we try to bury. But they don't always stay buried, Sophie concluded, demonstrating once again her remarkable perception. No, Jack agreed, looking toward Reynolds. They don't. Sullivan finished binding Reynolds's shoulder and securing his hands. The colonel is waiting outside, he reported. What should I tell him? Jack hesitated. His relationship with Blackwell had fundamentally changed with the revelations about Cold Harbor and the true purpose behind the railroad's interest in Silver Creek. The man he'd once followed without question was now revealed as manipulative and calculating, willing to sacrifice others for his ambitions. Yet Blackwell had assisted in the rescue operation, placing himself at risk despite his position and age. Whatever his motivations, he'd helped save Sophie. Tell him we've secured Reynolds and recovered Sophie safely, Jack decided, and that we'll all have much to discuss once we return to town. Sullivan nodded and departed toward the entrance. Jack gathered Sophie in his arms, lifting her despite the pain from his injured ribs. Can we go home now? She asked, resting her head against his shoulder. Soon, Jack promised. There are a few things I need to take care of first. They emerged from the mine into the gathering darkness. Blackwell waited anxiously nearby, relief washing over his features when he saw Sophie safe in Jack's arms. Thank God, he said, approaching cautiously. Is she hurt? No, Jack replied tersely. No thanks to your son's associates. Blackwell flinched at the mention of Marcus. Jack, about what Reynolds said about Cold Harbor and Petersburg, there are explanations. Not now. Jack cut him off, nodding toward Sophie. This isn't the time or place. Blackwell looked at Sophie, genuine remorse in his expression. Of course, I'm sorry, young lady, for everything you've endured today. It should never have happened. Sophie regarded him solemnly. You're the man who gives orders, she said simply. The one who told my daddy where to go during the war. Blackwell seemed startled by her directness. Yes, I was your father's commanding officer. And the bad man in the cave said you sent people into traps, that you didn't care if they got hurt as long as you got what you wanted. Jack started to intervene, but Blackwell raised a hand. It's all right, Jack. He addressed Sophie directly with the same gravity he might use with an adult. During war, young lady commanders sometimes have to make terrible choices. Choices where people get hurt no matter what you decide. Sometimes the best you can do is try to make sure their sacrifice accomplishes something worthwhile. Did you tell them they were being sacrificed? Sophie asked, cutting to the heart of the matter with childlike directness. Blackwell hesitated, then shook his head. No, I didn't. That wasn't very brave, Sophie said simply. The condemnation, delivered without anger, but with absolute moral certainty, seemed to strike Blackwell more deeply than any adult accusation could have. He looked away. The confident railroad baron momentarily replaced by an old man confronting the cost of his life's decisions. No, he agreed quietly. It wasn't. The journey back to Silver Creek was largely silent. Reynolds and his captured associate were transported in a wagon under Sullivan's watchful eye, while Jack rode with Sophie before him on his horse, unwilling to let her out of his sight. Blackwell rode beside them, occasionally glancing at Jack, as if wanting to speak, but respecting the barrier that now existed between them. The colonel's revelations had fundamentally altered their relationship, not just the manipulation during the war, but the calculated way he'd approached Silver Creek, seeing it as a resource to exploit, rather than a community of people with their own hopes and claims. As they approached town, lights glowed warmly against the night sky. Word of Sophie's rescue had evidently spread, as townspeople gathered along the main street watching their return, with expressions ranging from relief to curiosity. Catherine Mitchell waited outside the doctor's office, her face bearing the marks of her encounter with Reynolds's men, a bruised cheek and a split lip that did nothing to diminish the intensity of her gaze as she searched for Sophie among the returning riders. When she spotted them, genuine joy transformed her features. "Sophie!" "Thank God," Jack reined in, helping Sophie dismount. The girl ran to Catherine, who knelt to embrace her, despite her own injuries. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked, examining Sophie with a doctor's thoroughness and a friend's concern. "I'm okay," Sophie assured her. "They didn't hurt me, but Daddy's bleeding." Catherine's eyes snapped to Jack, noting the bloodstains spreading on his shirt. "Inside, both of you. Now." "Reynolds needs medical attention, too," Jack said, nodding toward the wagon where the wounded Confederate sat under guard. "He can wait," Catherine replied firmly. "I'm treating my friends first." Inside the doctor's office, old Doc Mitchell was already preparing bandages and medicinal supplies. He greeted Jack with gruff concern, helping him remove his shirt to reveal the knife wound along his ribs. "Clean cut," the old doctor assessed. "Not too deep. You were lucky." "Skill, not luck," Jack corrected, wincing as the wound was cleaned. Catherine supervised Sophie's examination, confirming that, beyond rope burns on her wrists and general exhaustion, the girl was physically unharmed. The emotional impact would take longer to assess, but Sophie's resilience continued to amaze Jack. She recounted her ordeal with remarkable composure, though she stayed close to Catherine's side throughout. As Doc Mitchell stitched Jack's wound, Deputy Collins arrived to report on the situation in town. Williams was captured trying to flee toward the territorial border, he informed Jack. Judge Parker has been briefed on everything: the kidnapping, Marcus Blackwell's death, Reynolds's capture. He's called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. "And Colonel Blackwell?" Jack asked. "Return to the hotel under escort," Collins replied. "Judge Parker wants him available for questioning but hasn't placed him under arrest. The Union Pacific lawyers are already making noise about jurisdiction and corporate immunity." Jack nodded, unsurprised. Men like Blackwell rarely faced conventional justice. Their wealth and connections provided insulation from the consequences that ordinary men faced. "What about Wilson?" Jack asked, remembering the old prospector who'd been shot by Marcus. "Recovering at the hotel," Collins reported. "Colonel Blackwell insisted on providing the best accommodations and care." "Attempting to buy goodwill," Catherine observed acerbically. "Typical." Once Jack was bandaged, and Sophie had been given a mild sedative to help her sleep, the question of where to spend the night arose. Their house, the scene of Sophie's abduction, had been left in disarray by Reynolds's men. "You'll stay with me," Catherine decided, brooking no argument. "My apartment above the pharmacy has a spare room. Sophie can take the bed. You can have the sofa." Jack started to protest, but exhaustion and the events of the day caught up with him. The thought of returning to their violated home held little appeal, especially with Sophie still processing her ordeal. "Thank you," he accepted simply. They walked through the quiet streets, Sophie drowsy from the sedative and being carried in Jack's arms despite his injured ribs. The town seemed unnaturally still, as if holding its breath before a storm. News of the day's events: the schoolhouse fire, Marcus Blackwell's death, Sophie's kidnapping and rescue had spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, leaving uncertainty and tension in its wake. Catherine's apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with books and medical journals that spoke of a mind constantly seeking knowledge. She quickly prepared the spare room for Sophie, turning down the covers and placing a fresh pitcher of water on the bedside table. Jack tucked his daughter in, sitting beside her, until her breathing deepened into sleep. Even in repose, her small hand clutched his, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "She's extraordinary," Catherine said softly from the doorway. Most adults wouldn't have handled today's events with half her composure. Jack nodded gently, disengaging his hand from Sophie's. "She's like her mother that way." Rachel faced everything head-on, no matter how frightening, and they moved to Catherine's small sitting room, where she poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to Jack. "For medicinal purposes," she said with the ghost of a smile. "Doctor's orders." Jack accepted the glass, taking a small sip. The liquor burned pleasantly, spreading warmth through his battered body. "Thank you for everything. Collins told me you fought when they came for Sophie." Catherine touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. "Not effectively enough, I'm afraid. There were 3 of them, and they took me by surprise." "You tried," Jack said simply. "That's more than most would have done." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each processing the day's events. Finally, Catherine asked the question that hung between them. "What happens now, Jack?" With Blackwell, the railroad, everything. It was the question he'd been avoiding since rescuing Sophie. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the larger issues remained. Blackwell's manipulations, the gold beneath Silver Creek, the railroad's plans for the town. "I don't know," he admitted. "Judge Parker will sort out the legal aspects of Reynolds's crimes and Marcus's death. But Blackwell and the Union Pacific, that's more complicated." "Because of your history with him," Catherine observed, "and what you learned today." Jack nodded, staring into his brandy. "He sacrificed my men at Cold Harbor, sent us into what he knew was an ambush to create a diversion for the main force. Never told us the real mission." "That's war, isn't it?" Catherine asked, not accusingly but thoughtfully. "Commanders making calculations with human lives." "It is," Jack acknowledged. "But there's a difference between necessary sacrifice and deliberate deception. Blackwell crossed that line, and he's still crossing it with Silver Creek, with the gold, with everything. Yet you can't simply expose him without exposing your own past," Catherine concluded perceptively. "The things you did under his orders during the war." Jack looked at her sharply. "What do you know about that?" "Enough," she replied evenly. "I treated soldiers from special units. Men who returned from missions they couldn't discuss with wounds that told stories they wouldn't. I can recognize the signs, Jack." He considered denying it, maintaining the facade he'd constructed since arriving in Silver Creek. But after everything that had happened, the deception seemed pointless. "I was an assassin," he said finally, the words feeling strange on his lips, after years of silence. "A specialized scout who eliminated high-value Confederate targets under Blackwell's direct command." Catherine didn't flinch from the confession. "And now he holds that knowledge over you. A sword of Damocles that could destroy the life you've built here." "Yes," Jack admitted. "If Silver Creek knew the full truth about my war service, they might see you differently," Catherine finished. "Or they might not. You've been their sheriff for 3 years, Jack. You've earned their trust through your actions here, not your past elsewhere." "Some would understand," Jack agreed. "Others wouldn't. And Sophie." He trailed off, the real fear emerging. "You're afraid of how she would see you," Catherine said gently, "if she knew her father had been more than just a scout." Jack nodded, unable to voice the fear that had haunted him since Rachel's death, that someday Sophie would learn the full truth about his wartime activities and look at him with fear or revulsion rather than trust and love. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Catherine said. More understanding, too. Sophie loves you for who you are now, not who you were during the war. And who am I now? Jack asked the question emerging from some deep place within him. Today, in that mine, I became Captain Foster again. The assassin. The killer. It was like stepping back into an old uniform that still fits perfectly. But you didn't kill Reynolds, Catherine pointed out. You should have given the threat he posed, but you chose justice over vengeance. That's not Captain Foster. That's Sheriff Foster. That's Sophie's father. Her words penetrated the doubts that had plagued him since the confrontation. It was true he had chosen the harder path, the path of law rather than expedience. Perhaps that choice, more than anything, defined who he truly was now. What will you do about Blackwell? Catherine asked, returning to the immediate problem. Jack considered the question carefully. Blackwell held power that extended far beyond Silver Creek, financial, political, and personal. Confronting him directly would be dangerous, potentially disastrous, for both Jack and Sophie. Yet allowing Blackwell to proceed unchallenged meant watching Silver Creek transform according to his vision rather than the community's needs. It meant the gold beneath their feet would enrich distant shareholders rather than local families. It meant accepting that power could operate unchecked as long as it wore a respectable face. I don't know yet, Jack admitted, but I know I can't just stand aside and watch him reshape Silver Creek for his own benefit. Catherine studied him thoughtfully. Perhaps there's a middle path, one that protects Sophie and your position here while still challenging Blackwell's plans. What kind of middle path? Information is power, Jack. Blackwell isn't the only one who knows secrets. You know things about him too, about Cold Harbor, about the true value of the land here. Knowledge that could be damaging if it reached the right ears. Jack considered this perspective. You're suggesting I blackmail him. I'm suggesting you negotiate from a position of strength, Catherine corrected. Make it clear that mutual destruction benefits neither of you. Find a compromise that protects what matters most, Sophie Silver Creek, your future here. It was a pragmatic approach, one that acknowledged the realities of power, while seeking the best possible outcome within those constraints. Not ideal, perhaps, but potentially effective. I'll consider it, Jack said finally, after I've spoken with Judge Parker tomorrow. Catherine nodded, accepting his measured response. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the events of the day settling around them like dust after a storm. Eventually, Jack's exhaustion became evident. Catherine rose, showing him to the sofa where she'd arranged blankets and a pillow. Try to rest, she advised. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As she turned to leave, Jack caught her hand gently. Why are you doing all this, risking yourself for Sophie and me? Catherine looked down at their joined hands, then met his gaze directly. Because some things are worth fighting for, Jack. Some people are worth standing beside no matter the cost. The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. After a moment, Catherine squeezed his hand once, then withdrew to her own room, leaving Jack to consider what futures might still be possible in the aftermath of so much upheaval. Sleep came surprisingly quickly despite the pain in his ribs and the tumult in his mind. His last conscious thought was of Sophie sleeping safely nearby, and the promise he'd made to himself when Rachel died that he would create a life worth living, a future worth fighting for, no matter what shadows the past might cast. Tomorrow would bring Judge Parker's hearing, a confrontation with Blackwell, and decisions that would shape Silver Creek's future. But for now, in the quiet darkness of Catherine's apartment, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace, a recognition that despite everything, he and Sophie had survived. and survival, as he'd learned both in war and peace, was sometimes victory enough for one day. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with a stillness that belied the tumult of the previous day. Jack Foster stood at Catherine Mitchell's window, watching the town come to life below. Shopkeepers swept boardwalks, the blacksmith stoked his forge, and Deputy Collins made his morning rounds, ordinary activities continuing despite extraordinary circumstances. The familiar rhythm of the town brought Jack a measure of comfort. Silver Creek had existed before Walter Blackwell arrived with his railroad plans and would continue after today's hearing determined the fate of Reynolds, and indirectly, Blackwell's grand ambitions. Behind him, Sophie still slept peacefully in Catherine's spare room. The sedative Doc Mitchell had provided ensured she'd rest through the night, her young mind temporarily shielded from the trauma she'd endured. Jack had checked on her repeatedly, reassuring himself of her safety each time. "Coffee." Catherine's voice drew his attention from the window. She stood in the doorway, already dressed for the day, holding 2 steaming cups. "Thank you." Jack accepted the offered cup, noting the dark circles beneath Catherine's eyes that suggested she'd slept as poorly as he had. "Judge Parker's hearing begins at 9, she said, joining him at the window. "The whole town's talking about it. Everyone has an opinion about what happened, though few know the full truth." "And what is the full truth?" Jack asked, more to himself than to Catherine. "That Marcus Blackwell was killed while resisting arrest, that his father has been planning to exploit Silver Creek from the beginning, that the sheriff has a past as a wartime assassin." Catherine's gaze was steady. "The truth is that you protected your daughter and this town from men who sought to harm both. Whatever else is revealed today, that remains the essential fact." Jack appreciated her unwavering support, but knew matters weren't so simple. Judge Hiram Parker was known for his uncompromising approach to justice. A former territorial marshal who'd survived 3 assassination attempts before hanging up his guns for judicial robes, Parker saw the world in stark terms of law and lawlessness. He would demand complete accounts, sworn testimony, and evidence before rendering judgment. "I should wake Sophie," Jack said, finishing his coffee. "Get her settled with Mrs. Hollister before the hearing." "Actually," Catherine replied cautiously, "I was thinking she might stay with me today. The pharmacy will be closed for the hearing, and she seems comfortable here." Jack considered the suggestion. Having Sophie away from the courthouse made sense. She'd been through enough without witnessing more conflict. And Catherine had proven her willingness to protect the girl even at personal risk. "If you're certain," Jack agreed. "But be vigilant. Reynolds may be in custody, but we don't know if he has other associates in town." "I'll keep her safe," Catherine promised. "And Jack, whatever happens at the hearing, remember, you're not facing it alone." The simple assurance steadied him as he prepared for the day ahead. After breakfast and explaining to a sleepy Sophie that she would stay with Dr. Catherine while he attended important sheriff business, Jack walked to the courthouse, aware of the eyes following his progress through town. Silver Creek's modest courthouse stood at the center of Main Street, its weathered clapboard exterior belying the serious proceedings conducted within. A crowd had already gathered outside, townspeople murmuring among themselves as Jack approached. They parted respectfully, many nodding or touching their hats in greeting. Despite the rumors and speculation swirling through town, Jack realized his standing remained largely intact. These were people who had known him for 3 years, who had seen him enforce the law fairly and protect their community. Whatever revelations might emerge today, that foundation of trust would not easily crumble. Inside the courtroom was arranged for the hearing, with Judge Parker's bench dominating the front. The territorial judge had arrived late the previous night, immediately reviewing affidavits and evidence, before sequestering himself to consider the complex case. Deputy Collins approached as Jack entered. Reynolds and Williams are secure in the holding cells, he reported quietly. Sullivan's guarding them personally. Blackwell arrived 10 minutes ago with 2 railroad lawyers. Any word on Wilson? Jack asked. Doc Mitchell's bringing him in. He's still weak, but insisted on testifying. Jack nodded his thanks, then took his position near the front of the courtroom. As sheriff, he would be both witness and officer of the court, an unusual dual role that reflected the extraordinary nature of the proceedings. The room filled quickly. Mayor Simmons and the town council occupied the front row, their expressions varying from concern to curiosity. Behind them sat Silver Creek's prominent citizens, merchants, ranchers, and professionals whose fortunes would be directly affected by the outcome of today's hearing. Walter Blackwell entered with military precision 5 minutes before the scheduled start, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, who could only be Union Pacific attorneys. His eyes met Jack's briefly, a complex mixture of emotions passing between them before Blackwell took his seat. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Parker entered the courtroom. Tall and lean, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, the judge carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. The bailiff called for all to rise, and the hearing began. This special session will address multiple serious matters, Parker announced, his voice carrying easily throughout the room. The death of Marcus Blackwell, the kidnapping of Sophie Foster, the assault on Dr. Mitchell, the shooting of Ezekiel Wilson, and various related criminal activities. He surveyed the room with practiced assessment. Due to the interconnected nature of these events and the presence of influential interests, his gaze flicked briefly toward Blackwell. I will conduct this proceeding with absolute transparency. All testimony will be given under oath, all evidence examined in open court, and all judgments rendered according to territorial law, regardless of who may be affected. The judge's emphasis on impartiality sent a murmur through the courtroom. Parker was making it clear that wealth and influence would find no special consideration in his court. Sheriff Foster, Parker continued, as the primary law enforcement officer involved in most of these incidents, you will provide the initial testimony. Please approach and be sworn in. Jack rose, feeling the weight of the moment. As he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, he made a private decision, complete honesty, whatever the consequences. Silver Creek and Sophie deserved nothing less. For the next hour, Jack provided a detailed account of the events since Blackwell's arrival. The confrontation at the saloon, the discovery of gold beneath Miller's Creek, and the cemetery, Marcus Blackwell's shooting of Wilson, the schoolhouse fire, Sophie's kidnapping, and the final confrontation at the mine. He omitted nothing significant, including Reynolds's accusations about Cold Harbor and Petersburg. Throughout his testimony, Jack kept his tone measured and factual, neither embellishing nor minimizing the events. When he described Marcus Blackwell's death, he was careful to emphasize that Sullivan had fired the fatal shots after Marcus aimed his weapon at Jack. And in your professional opinion, Sheriff, Judge Parker asked, was Mr. Sullivan's use of lethal force justified under the circumstances? Jack considered the question carefully. Marcus Blackwell was drawing his weapon with clear intent to fear. Mr. Sullivan, as Colonel Blackwell's security officer, had reason to believe I was in imminent danger. Based on those facts alone, the shooting could be considered justified. But you have reservations, Parker observed shrewdly. I do, Jack acknowledged. The precision of the shots and Sullivan's immediate action suggest he may have been prepared to eliminate Marcus, regardless of the specific circumstances. Parker nodded, making a note. Thank you for your candor, Sheriff. You may step down for now. Over the next 2 hours, additional witnesses provided testimony. Catherine Mitchell described Sophie's abduction and her own assault with clinical precision. Ezekiel Wilson, supported by Doc Mitchell, recounted being shot by Marcus Blackwell for refusing to sign over his claim. Deputy Collins detailed the evidence collected from the mine, including maps showing the gold deposits and documents linking Marcus to Reynolds. Finally, Judge Parker called Walter Blackwell to testify. The railroad director approached the stand with dignity, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to command rather than questioning. After being sworn in, Blackwell provided his account of events, carefully distancing himself from his son's actions while expressing appropriate regret for the harm caused. His testimony largely corroborated Jack's, though he characterized the Cold Harbor incident as unfortunate strategic necessity rather than deliberate sacrifice. Colonel Blackwell, Parker said, after the initial testimony, documents recovered from the mine indicate your railroad's interest in Silver Creek was primarily motivated by gold deposits, rather than transportation needs. Is this accurate? Blackwell hesitated, clearly weighing his response. The Union Pacific considers multiple factors when planning routes, Your Honor. Mineral resources are certainly one consideration, but not the only one. Yet you concealed this information from the town council and property owners when negotiating rights of way and purchases, Parker pressed. Business negotiations often involve confidential information, Blackwell replied smoothly. The railroad offered fair market value for all properties required. Fair market value for surface rights, Parker clarified, while intending to extract significantly more valuable mineral rights beneath. Some might consider that deceptive practice. Blackwell's lawyers stirred uncomfortably, but the colonel maintained his composure. Your Honor, if every business disclosed all potential future revenue before negotiating purchases, commerce would grind to a halt. We acted within legal parameters. Legal, perhaps? Ethical is another question entirely. Parker turned a page in his notes. Now, regarding your son's actions and your own role in these events. For the next 30 minutes, Parker methodically dissected Blackwell's testimony, exposing inconsistencies and evasions with the precision of a surgeon. Throughout, Blackwell maintained his dignified demeanor, though Jack noted beads of sweat forming on his brow as the questioning intensified. A final question, Colonel, Parker said eventually. Documents found at the mine reference contingency operations authorized by you personally. These operations appear to include intimidation of property owners and potentially criminal actions to secure railroad interests. What can you tell us about these authorizations? The courtroom fell silent. This was the moment that could potentially link Blackwell directly to criminal activity rather than merely unethical business practices. Blackwell straightened in his chair. Your Honor, as Director of Union Pacific's Western expansion, I authorize numerous operational plans and contingencies. I categorically deny authorizing any illegal activities, including intimidation or violence. If such actions occurred, they were without my knowledge or approval. Yet your son seemed to believe otherwise, Parker observed. According to multiple witnesses, he explicitly referenced your methods and teaching when justifying his actions. Marcus was... Blackwell paused, genuine pain crossing his features. My son was troubled, impulsive. He misinterpreted business necessity as permission for reckless behavior. I bear responsibility for failing to guide him properly, but not for authorizing his criminal actions. Parker studied Blackwell for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you, Colonel. You may step down. The final witness was Derek Sullivan, whose testimony proved surprisingly forthright. He admitted to killing Marcus Blackwell, claiming justified defense of Jack during the confrontation. When questioned about his role in the railroad's operations, Sullivan described himself as security consultant who ensured the safety of Union Pacific personnel and property. And did your duties include removing obstacles to the railroad's plans? Parker asked pointedly. Sullivan's expression remained impassive. I protected the railroad's legitimate interests within legal boundaries, Your Honor. Even when those obstacles were elderly prospectors or unmarked graves, I followed orders within legal parameters, Sullivan repeated. When Marcus Blackwell exceeded those parameters, I did not participate in his actions. As Sullivan concluded his testimony, Judge Parker called a brief recess to consider the evidence before rendering judgment. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as people discussed the revelations and speculated about potential outcomes. Jack stepped outside for fresh air, finding Blackwell already on the courthouse steps, smoking a cigar with practiced nonchalance. "Quite a performance in there, Sheriff," Blackwell remarked as Jack approached. "Very thorough testimony." "It wasn't a performance," Jack replied evenly. "Just the truth. Your version of it, perhaps." Blackwell exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Though I notice you omitted certain details about your own wartime activities. Selective honesty has its advantages, doesn't it?" "I answered the questions I was asked," Jack said. "If Judge Parker wants details about my military service, I'll provide them." Blackwell studied him thoughtfully. "You've changed, Jack. The man I commanded would never have risked exposing himself this way." "That man died at Appomattox," Jack replied. "Or maybe when Rachel did. Either way, he's gone." "Is he?" Blackwell's gaze was penetrating. "I saw him yesterday in that mine. The precision, the focus, the absolute commitment to the mission. Captain Foster is still very much alive inside you." Jack couldn't deny the observation entirely. The skills and instincts remained surfacing when needed. The difference is how I choose to use those abilities now, and why. "Noble sentiments," Blackwell acknowledged. "But practicality eventually reasserts itself. The world runs on power, Jack, not principles. Men like us understand that better than most." "We're not the same," Jack said firmly. "Aren't we?" Blackwell dropped his cigar, crushing it beneath his boot. "We both made hard choices during the war. We both have blood on our hands. The only difference is that I've continued building something afterward, an empire of steel and progress that will reshape this nation. What have you built besides a quiet life in a forgotten town?" "A home," Jack answered simply. "A place where Sophie can grow up safe and loved. Where I can be the man Rachel believed I could be." Blackwell's expression softened slightly. "I had those dreams once. After Elizabeth died," he shook his head. "Perhaps that's where I failed Marcus. I built a business instead of a home." Before Jack could respond, the courthouse bell rang, signaling the end of recess. They returned to the courtroom in silence, the brief moment of connection fading as quickly as it had appeared. Judge Parker resumed his place at the bench, his expression grave as he surveyed the packed courtroom. "Having heard all testimony and reviewed the evidence, I am prepared to render judgment on the matters before this court." He began with the simplest determinations. Reynolds and Williams would be transferred to territorial custody to await trial for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. Sullivan was cleared of wrongdoing in Marcus Blackwell's death, the judge ruling it justifiable homicide in defense of an officer of the law. Then Parker turned to the more complex matters. "Regarding Union Pacific's business practices in Silver Creek, while I find evidence of deliberate deception and unethical negotiation, these matters fall primarily under civil rather than criminal jurisdiction." The railroad lawyers exchanged satisfied glances, but Parker wasn't finished. "However, documents recovered from the mine provide compelling evidence that Union Pacific, specifically under Colonel Blackwell's direction, attempted to circumvent territorial mining regulations by disguising mineral extraction as railroad construction. This constitutes fraud against the territorial government. Murmurs swept through the courtroom as Blackwell's expression darkened. Furthermore, Parker continued, evidence suggests the railroad knowingly employed individuals with criminal histories to intimidate property owners, particularly in the case of Ezekiel Wilson. While direct evidence linking Colonel Blackwell to these activities is circumstantial, the pattern of behavior is concerning enough to warrant further investigation by territorial authorities. Parker fixed Blackwell with a stern gaze. Colonel, while you are not under arrest at this time, I am referring these matters to the territorial prosecutor for potential indictment. You will surrender your travel documents and remain available for questioning until that determination is made. Blackwell's lawyers immediately began whispering urgent advice, but the colonel himself remained stoically silent, his eyes fixed on the judge. Finally, Parker said, regarding the proposed railroad development in Silver Creek. He paused, considering his words carefully. The evidence presented today reveals that Union Pacific's plans were predicated on deception and exploitation rather than mutual benefit. Therefore, I am suspending all railroad development activities pending a full review by territorial authorities. An audible gasp rose from the assembly. Parker raised his hand for silence. The legitimate need for transportation remains, he acknowledged, but any future development must proceed with complete transparency and genuine partnership with the community. To that end, I am establishing a commission comprising Silver Creek citizens and territorial representatives to evaluate future proposals and ensure fair treatment of all parties. Parker's gaze swept the courtroom, his expression stern but just. This community has endured trauma and deception. Healing will require time and truth. Let today's proceedings serve as reminder that in this territory law applies equally to all, whether they arrive on horseback or in private rail cars. With a sharp rap of his gavel, Parker concluded the hearing. The courtroom erupted in conversation as people absorbed the judge's rulings and their implications for Silver Creek's future. Jack watched as Blackwell conferred intensely with his lawyers, his composure finally showing cracks, as the full impact of Parker's judgment became clear. The railroad's plans had been derailed, its director facing potential criminal charges, its reputation tarnished by the public revelations. Deputy Collins approached looking both relieved and overwhelmed. What now, Sheriff, with the railroad plans suspended and half the town wondering what happens next? Now we do our jobs, Jack replied simply. Maintain order, enforce the law, protect the community. Same as always. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Jack found himself face to face with Blackwell one final time. The railroad director had dismissed his lawyers, preferring this conversation without witnesses. Quite a setback, Jack observed neutrally. Temporary, Blackwell replied with unexpected calm. The railroad will still come to Silver Creek, Jack. Perhaps not exactly as I envisioned, but progress is inevitable. You've won the battle, not the war. This wasn't about winning, Jack said. It was about truth, about doing what's right for this town. Blackwell studied him with something like respect. You really believe that, don't you? That principles matter more than power? I do, Jack affirmed, because without principles, power corrupts everything it touches. You taught me that, though probably not as you intended. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwell's lips. Perhaps, or perhaps you'll find that principles without power accomplish nothing in this world. He extended his hand. Either way, I suspect our paths will cross again, Captain. Jack hesitated, then accepted the handshake. Sheriff, he corrected firmly. Just sheriff now. Of course, Blackwell acknowledged. Until next time, Sheriff Foster. But Jack had watched him leave, sensing this wasn't truly the end of their complicated relationship. Blackwell was right about one thing: the railroad would eventually come to Silver Creek. The forces of progress couldn't be permanently halted. But perhaps next time the terms would be fairer, the benefits more widely shared. Outside the courthouse, Catherine waited with Sophie, both of them watching anxiously as Jack emerged into the afternoon sunlight. "Daddy!" Sophie broke free, running to him with unrestrained joy. "Dr. Catherine said you were being very brave in there." Jack lifted her into his arms, ignoring the twinge from his injured ribs. "Not as brave as you, sweetheart." "Is it all over now?" Sophie asked, her expression suddenly serious. "The bad men won't come back." Jack considered how to answer truthfully without frightening her. "Reynolds and his men are going to prison for a long time. They can't hurt anyone anymore." "What about the railroad man, the one who knew you from the war?" Jack met Catherine's gaze over Sophie's head, seeing understanding in her eyes. "Colonel Blackwell will be leaving Silver Creek soon. His railroad plans are being changed to be more fair to everyone in town." Sophie nodded, processing this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "That's good. Mrs. Hollister says trains are important, but not more important than people." "Mrs. Hollister is very wise," Jack agreed, setting Sophie down, but keeping hold of her hand. "Now, what do you say we go home and start putting things back in order?" "Can Dr. Catherine come too?" Sophie asked hopefully. "She told me all about Florence Nightingale while you were in court, and she has more books about her at her apartment." Jack looked to Catherine, who smiled warmly. "I'd be happy to help if you'd like the company." "We would," Jack affirmed, surprising himself with how right the words felt. "Very much." The three of them walked down Silver Creek's main street, passing townspeople who nodded respectfully or called out greetings. News of Judge Parker's rulings was spreading rapidly, and with it a sense that the community had weathered a storm and emerged stronger. As they reached Jack and Sophie's small house, Catherine paused. "What happens now?" "Jack, for Silver Creek for you and Sophie." Jack considered the question while unlocking the door. Inside, evidence of Reynolds's men remained: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, but nothing that couldn't be repaired or restored. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We make things better than they were before." He glanced at Catherine. "Together, if that's something you might want." The invitation hung between them, laden with possibilities beyond merely restoring order to a disrupted house. Catherine's smile deepened, reaching her eyes with a warmth that answered his question before she spoke. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. Sophie looked between them, a knowing expression beyond her years crossing her face. "Mama would like Dr. Catherine," she announced with childlike certainty. "She always said brave people should stick together." Jack felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing wound. "Your mother was very wise, too." He managed his voice thick with emotion. As they stepped inside to begin the work of restoration, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the battlefields of the Civil War to the contested grounds of Silver Creek, he had traveled a long road, seeking redemption, peace, and purpose. The past would always be with him. The choices made, the blood spilled, the orders followed and questioned. But the future remained unwritten, full of possibilities he'd once thought forever closed to him. A future with Sophie, growing strong and confident. A future where Silver Creek prospered on its own terms. Perhaps even a future where Catherine Mitchell's brave heart became intertwined with his own. Outside, the Wyoming sun cast long afternoon shadows across the frontier town. In the distance, the abandoned mine and the old cemetery stood as reminders of what had nearly been lost and what had been preserved. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Walter Blackwell was already planning his next move, and the inexorable march of progress continued. But here in this moment, in this modest house on the edge of a growing town, Jackson Foster had found something worth more than gold, or power, or railroads. He had found his true home, not just a place but a purpose. Not just survival, but a life worth living. And for a man who had once moved through darkness as death's messenger, that was redemption enough. End of Part 5. The End.